The cold hit him in the face before he regained consciousness. Dan Reed was lying face down in the snow and could feel ice crystals packing into his nostrils. There was a metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to breathe in and coughed. The snow was deep, too deep. He braced himself with his palms and struggled to lift his head. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No hum of engines, no airplanes, no distant noise from the highway. Only the wind whistling through the tops of the fir trees, and somewhere very far away, a woman was screaming. Dan blinked. The trees around him were strange. Too tall, too thick. The trunks soared 30 meters upward and vanished into the gray haze of the sky. He slowly sat up and looked around. His down jacket with the store logo was soaking. His jeans were frozen stiff. His thin-soled sneakers no longer kept him warm. He looked at his hands. The same hands. The same fingers with calluses from the bowstring. The same fingernails with that ever-present strip of glue under the edge. He was himself. But he definitely wasn't in Portland. A movement to his right made him freeze. A deer stood 30 paces away among the tree trunks. Only it wasn't a deer. The creature was the size of a horse. Bony growths ran along its spine from the skull to the sacrum, white, smooth, like polished stone. The antlers branched out in 6 tiers, and each prong ended in a sharp spike. The animal was staring straight at Dan. Its eyes were black, no whites, no pupils. Just 2 patches of darkness in a massive skull. Dan held his breath. He knew deer. He'd been hunting deer in Oregon since he was 14. This wasn't a deer. It was something pretending to be a deer, or something a deer might have become if evolution had taken a wrong turn. The creature snorted. 2 clouds of steam burst from its nostrils. Then the woman's scream rang out again. Closer. Louder. The deer jerked its head and, in 3 leaps, vanished among the trees. Snow fell from the lower branches. Dan sat there staring at the tracks. Each hoofprint was the size of a plate. He slowly stood up. His legs wouldn't obey him. His head was throbbing as if someone had struck him on the temple with something heavy. He touched his left temple and hissed. There was a bump the size of a walnut. The skin wasn't broken, but it throbbed hot and painfully beneath his fingers. The scream rang out a 3rd time. Dan headed toward the sound. He didn't think about why. He just went because standing still in an unfamiliar forest at -15 in a wet jacket meant certain death. Walking was hard. The snow came up to his knees. His sneakers sank with every step. After 5 minutes, he lost feeling in his toes. After 10, he saw a clearing between the trees. After 15, he reached the edge of a clearing and stopped. A village. A dozen or so houses. Log walls. Shingle roofs. Some were leaning. Thin wisps of smoke drifted from the chimneys. Not the thick, steady smoke of a well-fed home, but thin wisps. They weren't burning much. They were saving. In the middle of the village stood a well with a wooden pulley. A woman was kneeling by the well crying. She cried quietly, almost silently. She covered her mouth with her hand so no one would hear. 2 children, about 5 or 6 years old, stood nearby, looking up at her. They weren't crying. They were too thin to cry. To the right of the well, across the clearing, a man was walking. Broad-shouldered, bearded, wearing a fur jacket tied with a rope. He carried an empty sack over his shoulder. Completely empty. He walked, staring at the ground, and from the look on his face, Dan understood everything. The hunter had returned empty-handed, not for the first time. Maybe the 10th, maybe the 20th. The woman by the well wasn't crying out of grief. She was crying because all hope was gone. Dan stood at the edge of the clearing in his ridiculous blue jacket with a patch and watched it all. The thoughts in his head were strangely simple. No panic, no terror, no wondering where he was or how to get back. Just one phrase. All right, so time to feed them. He took a step forward and stepped out of the woods. They spotted him immediately. A hunter with an empty bag stopped. The woman by the well looked up. An old man with a cane came out of the nearest house. Then another man. Then a woman carrying a child. They looked at Dan the way people look at something they couldn't understand. Not hostile, not joyful, with that dull, wary attention with which hungry people look at anything new. Maybe it's food. Maybe it's trouble. The old man approached first. He was short, wiry. His face was brown from the cold and the wind. His eyes were small and intelligent. He said something. Dan didn't understand a word. The language was unfamiliar. It sounded like something from the north. Maybe Scandinavian. Maybe not. The old man repeated himself. Dan spread his arms and pointed to his ears, then to his mouth. Then he shook his head. The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at his jacket, then at his sneakers, then back at his face. He turned to the hunter with the empty bag and said something brief. The hunter shrugged. The old man sighed. He pointed to the shed on the edge of the village. Then he made a gesture with his hand. Sleep. That's clear in any language. Dan nodded. He walked toward the shed, and with every step he took, his sneakers left ridiculous tracks in the snow. The whole village watched his back. The shed was cold. The cracks between the boards let the wind through. In the corner lay a pile of rotten straw. It smelled of manure and old wood. Dan sat down in the straw and pulled his knees up to his chest. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the cold. He sat there and thought. A deer with bony growths. A village from another century. A language he didn't know. A jacket that was worth nothing here. He could have panicked. He could have screamed. He could have curled up into a ball and waited to wake up. But for 3 years, Dan Reed had been designing bows for people who needed to hit a target from 70 meters away. For 3 years, he'd been solving problems with no obvious solutions. Every bow is an equation. Draw length, draw weight, arrow weight, distance to the target. You don't panic in the face of an equation. You solve it. He started with what he knew. People were hungry. A hunter walks around with an empty bag. That means there's game, but they can't get it. The deer he'd seen was enormous. Bone plates along its spine. A regular arrow from a simple bow wouldn't penetrate it. Even a well-aimed shot would ricochet off the bone. A different bow is needed. Different arrowheads. A different approach is needed. He knew how to do it. He'd been doing it his entire adult life. Only instead of carbon fiber and fiberglass, he'd have to use antler and tendons. Instead of epoxy resin, fish glue. Instead of a CNC machine, a knife and his hands. But the principle is the same. The principle is always the same. A composite bow is like a layered cake. Wood in the center for shape. Horn on the inside for compression. Tendon on the outside for tension. 3 materials, 3 forces, 1 bow. Half as long as a regular bow. 3 times as powerful. The Mongols knew this. The Turks knew this. The Koreans knew this. Entire empires were built on this knowledge. But here, judging by what he'd seen behind the hunter's back, they were shooting with a single piece of wood. Long, heavy, weak, just like in England before composite bows made their way there. Dan closed his eyes. His head still ached. His toes were starting to come back to life, and it hurt more than when they were numb. But the plan was already taking shape in his mind. Find an ash tree. Find a horn or a bone. Find tendons. Find glue. He had a knife. He had his hands. 3 days to let the shoulders dry. 1 day to assemble it. 1 day for the bowstring and sighting. 5 days. If they gave him 5 days, he'd make a bow that could pierce that deer's bone plate. And if it pierced the plate, it would pierce the hide too. And if it pierced the hide, there'd be meat. And if there's meat, they won't kick him out. And if they don't kick him out, he'll have time to figure out where he is and what's going on. An equation. Step by step. He didn't notice when he'd fallen asleep. He woke up when someone touched his shoulder. He flinched and opened his eyes. Standing over him was a boy of about 5. Skinny, sunken cheeks, eyes huge on his small face. The boy was holding out a piece of something dark to him. Bread, or what they called bread here. Dense, heavy, with a taste of bark. Dan took it. The boy stared at him without blinking. Then he poked his finger at Dan's jacket, then at the patch on his chest. Then he said something in his own language. 1 word. Dan didn't understand, but he smiled. The boy smiled back. He was missing his 2 front teeth. Then he ran off. Dan sat there with a piece of bread in his hand, staring at the doorway through which snow was blowing in. Someone in this village had given a piece of food to a stranger. Someone had given up food that their own children didn't have enough of. He took a bite of the bread, chewed it, swallowed it, stood up. The morning was gray and bleak. The wind lashed against the barn walls. Fine, stinging snow was falling. Dan went outside and walked through the village. People looked at him, but no one approached. He was looking for two things: a blacksmith shop and a trash heap. He found the blacksmith shop by the sound. The faint tapping of a hammer came from a squat building with a stone chimney on the edge of the village. He found the junk nearby. Behind the blacksmith shop lay a pile of scrap, rusty pieces of iron, bent nails, and among other things, a broken bow. An old one, cracked, made from a single piece of yew. The limb had snapped in the middle, but on the inside, plates had been sewn on. Horn plates, thin, darkened by time. Someone had once tried to reinforce the bow with horn plates. It didn't work. The plates came loose. The bow broke. It was thrown away. Dan picked up the fragments and turned them over in his hands. The horn was dried out but not destroyed. The structure remained intact. If soaked and re-glued properly, it could be used. He set the fragments down beside him and peered into the smithy. A woman, not a man. A woman of about 24 stood at the anvil, striking a piece of iron with a hammer. Her blows were precise but weak. She was thin. Her hands were too slender for blacksmithing, but she knew what she was doing. You could tell by the way she held the tongs, by the way she turned the workpiece. She looked up and saw Dan. She froze. He pointed at the bow fragments, then at the workbench, then at himself. Then he made a gesture with his hands. Get to work. She looked at him for a few seconds. Then she nodded briefly and returned to the anvil. Dan walked into the smithy and sat down at the workbench. The heat from the forge hit his face, and he almost groaned with relief. For the first time in a day, he felt warm. He laid out the fragments of the bow in front of him and began to work. His hands remembered. Hands always remember. For 3 days, Dan didn't leave the smithy. The blacksmith worked nearby and asked no questions. She tapped her workpieces with a hammer. He planed a wooden base from an ash branch he'd cut down at the edge of the forest. They didn't speak to each other because they couldn't. But the silence between them was one of work. The kind of silence that exists between people doing the same task in the same place. It wasn't oppressive. It simply was. Language began to come back in bits and pieces. On the second day, Dan realized that the word they repeated most often meant to eat, or food, or hunger. One word for all 3 meanings. He memorized 5 words a day. He'd point at an object. The woman would say the word. He'd repeat it. She'd shake her head. He'd repeat it again. She'd nod. By the end of the second day, he knew how to say fire, water, knife, tree, bone, horn, iron, meat, cold, pain, yes, no. Enough to survive, not enough to explain what he was doing. The bow took shape slowly. Dan cut a branch from an ash tree, 2 fingers thick and an elbow long. He planed away the pith. He left the limbs symmetrical. He rounded off the grip. That was the foundation, the skeleton. He soaked the horn plates from the old bow in warm water by the hearth. When they became pliable, he trimmed off the excess with a knife. He shaped them to fit the inner side of each limb. Horn works by compression. When you pull the bowstring, the bow's shoulder bends inward. The inner side compresses. Horn doesn't break under compression. It springs back. It returns energy. For the outer side, he needed tendons. He gestured to the female blacksmith, asking her to show him where they kept the scraps from butchering. She led him to a pit behind the farthest house. There lay scraps of hides and bones. Among them, he found tendons, old, stiff, but usable. He soaked them in water and split them into thin fibers. Each fiber was like a thread. Hundreds of threads. He laid them in layers on the outer side of the shoulders and glued them down. He made the glue himself. Scraps of hide, water. He simmered it for a long time over low heat until it became a thick, viscous mass. Fish glue would have been better, but there were no fish. The hide glue held less well, but it held. He dried each layer separately. He pressed them down with a wrap made of strips of leather. He waited. Then he dried the next one. 3 layers of tendons. 3 rounds of 4 hours of drying each. A thin layer of glue between each layer. The female blacksmith watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw her. On the 3rd day, an old man came to the smithy. The very same one who'd let Dan into the barn. With him came a hunter carrying an empty bag. And another man, a burly, red-bearded, with heavy hands and a mocking face. It was Bren. Dan didn't know his name yet. The old man spoke, at length, sternly. Dan understood every other word. Stranger, eats, doesn't work. How much? The meaning was clear. You've been here 3 days. You're eating our bread. What are you giving in return? Dan didn't answer with words. He turned to the workbench and picked up the bow. It wasn't ready yet. He hadn't strung it. The glue on the last layer of tendons hadn't dried completely. But its shape was visible. Short, curved, unfamiliar. The shoulders arched forward, so that when unstrung, the bow looked as if it had been turned inside out. The old man looked at the bow, then at Dan, then back at the bow. Bren stepped forward and held out his hand. Dan handed it over. Bren turned the bow over in his hands. He tried to bend the shoulder with his fingers. The shoulder wouldn't budge. He pressed harder. The shoulder gave slightly and then immediately sprang back. Bren grunted. Then he looked at Dan and said something. From the tone of his voice, it sounded like a question. Maybe he asked what it was. Maybe he asked why. Dan gestured. Tomorrow. He held up one finger. One day. Tomorrow he'd show him. The old man and Bren exchanged glances. The old man shrugged. They left. Dan worked all night. The blacksmith had gone to her quarters but left the forge smoldering. Warmth. The light from the coals. Silence. His hands did what they knew how to do. He pulled the bowstring made of twisted sinew taut. He checked the bend. His shoulders stood straight. The bow was short, 1.5 times shorter than those long sticks he'd seen the locals use. But the draw weight was different. He could feel it in his hands. 30 pounds for the locals, maybe 35. His bow was close to 50, maybe more. The antler and tendons did their job. Energy was stored in his shoulders and transferred to the arrow. Short, sharp, powerful. All that was left was to make the arrows. He stepped out into the pre-dawn chill and found a bundle of straight shoots by the shed. He cut off 4. He planed them down, straightened them out. He made the fletching from feathers he'd gathered near the chicken coop. 3 feathers per arrow, at an angle so the arrow would spin in flight. The arrowheads were a problem. He didn't have any iron ones. There was no time left to ask the blacksmith. He made bone ones. He whittled bone fragments from the same trash heap. Rough, heavy, not perfect, but enough for one shot. Morning. Gray, like all mornings here. The snow had stopped falling. The wind had died down. Dan stepped out onto the square with a bow in one hand and 4 arrows in the other. People were watching. There weren't many of them, about 15. An old man stood by his house. Bren was next to him. The blacksmith's wife stepped out onto the threshold of the smithy and leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. She was holding a boy in her arms. That very boy. The one with missing teeth. The one who'd brought Dan bread on the first night. Her son. Dan realized this only now. Bren stepped forward and looked at the bow, then at Dan. Then he laughed. Loudly. Openly. Without malice, but with complete certainty that this was a joke. He said something and several men behind him laughed too. Dan didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. You couldn't even hit a tree with that toy. Dan didn't reply. He turned to face the far end of the clearing. There stood a post, a tether post, thick, weathered, 70 paces away. He knocked an arrow, raised the bow. He exhaled. He pulled the bowstring to the corner of his mouth. The bow's limbs bent. The tendons on the outside stretched tight as strings. The horn on the inside contracted. 2 materials, 2 forces, 1 arrow. He released it. The sound was different. Not the soft thud these people were used to. Dry, sharp, short. Like the crack of a whip. The arrow flew straight, without wavering, without rising. A flat trajectory. It struck the pole and sank halfway into the shaft. The bone tip pierced the wood right through and stopped only when the shaft hit the edges of the hole. The square fell silent. Bren stopped laughing. He stood there, staring at the pole. Then he slowly took off his hat and scratched the back of his head. One of the men walked up to the pole and tried to pull the arrow out. He couldn't. He rocked it back and forth. He pulled with both hands. He pulled it out with a crunch. He looked at the arrowhead. He looked at Dan across the square. The silence lasted a long time. Then the old man turned and walked back to his house. A minute later, he returned. He was holding a bowl, a clay bowl, a large one. Steam rose from the bowl. Stew. Hot, thick, with chunks of something meaty at the bottom. The old man walked over to Dan and held out the bowl. He didn't say a word. He just held it out. Dan took it. He ate standing in the middle of the clearing, and the hot stew ran down his chin and dripped onto his jacket. It was the best meal of his life. Bren approached as Dan was finishing his meal. The red-bearded hunter stood nearby and silently looked at the bow that Dan had set down in the snow. Then he pointed at the bow, then at the forest, then at himself, then back at Dan. Together, the hunt, tomorrow. Dan nodded. Bren held out his hand, a large, rough hand. Dan shook it. The handshake was firm. Bren turned and walked away. The woman by the smithy was still standing in the doorway with the boy in her arms. She was looking at Dan, and for the first time ever, she didn't look away when he looked back at her. They set out before dawn. Bren led the way. Dan followed behind him, step for step, footstep for footprint. Bren moved through the forest like a man who had spent his whole life there. Quietly, confidently, every step precise, every turn deliberate. He knew where the snow cover held firm and where it gave way. He knew which branches would snap and which wouldn't. Dan followed him and learned. He was a quick learner. That was another thing he was good at. His language skills had made significant progress in just a week. Bren turned out to be a good teacher, not because he explained things patiently, but because he spoke little, and every word was to the point. A tree, wind, quiet, look, track, old, new, there, Dan repeated. Bren nodded or shook his head. By the end of the first week, Dan could form a simple sentence. By the end of the second, he was speaking like a 3-year-old, clumsily, but clearly. Bren led him to the trail, an animal trail, well-trodden. 2 tracks in the snow, each as wide as a palm. Hooves, large. Bren pointed. A moose. It comes through here every morning. The trail leads from the watering hole to its resting place. Dan crouched down and examined the tracks. Deep, a heavy beast. He looked up at the trees around them. The wind was blowing from the west. The trail ran north to south. If we stand to the east, the wind will carry the scent away. He pointed to Bren. Over there. We'll stand there. The wind is blowing away from us. Bren looked at him with a new expression. Not surprise, not respect, recognition, as if he'd realized that this strange outsider in a ridiculous jacket knew something only a hunter should know. They took up position behind a fallen tree trunk 30 paces from the trail. The wind blew in their faces. Dan nocked an arrow. Bren stood beside him with his longbow. They waited for an hour. The cold seeped through everything. Dan didn't move a muscle. He was good at that too. Hours spent lying in wait for deer in Oregon had taught him how to wait. A deer emerged from behind a spruce tree. The very same one. Or one just like it. Huge. Bony protrusions along its spine, black eyes. It walked along the trail slowly, confidently. It feared nothing. Why be afraid when you're the biggest beast in the forest and no arrow can pierce your hide? Dan waited. 30 paces. 25. 20. At 20, he saw what he was looking for. A joint. Behind the front shoulder blade, the spot where the bony plates parted, revealing ordinary hide between them. Dark, soft, unarmored. Every piece of armor has a gap. He knew that. Everyone who worked with armor-piercing arrowheads knew that. Don't hit the plate. Hit between the plates. He pulled the bowstring. The bow's limbs bent. The tendons tautened. The horn tightened. 50 pounds of force weighted in his fingers. He exhaled. He let go. The arrow struck the deer squarely in the joint behind the shoulder blade. It went in deep. The beast twitched. It wheezed. It took 3 steps and fell to its knees. Then it collapsed onto its side. The snow around him turned dark. Bren stood nearby, his mouth agape. His arrow was still knocked on the bowstring. He hadn't even had time to shoot. He looked at Dan, then at the deer, then back at Dan. He said one word. Dan didn't know that word, but from the tone, he realized it was something like a curse, an admiring curse. They approached the carcass. The deer was heavy. Dan estimated it weighed about 300 kilograms, maybe more. There was enough meat here to feed the whole village for a week. Bone plates, antlers, bones. All of this was worth money. All of this had a price in a world where magical beasts were the backbone of the economy. But the most important thing was inside. Dan pointed to the chest cavity for Brenna. They cut open the carcass together. Inside, among the usual organs, in the center of the chest cavity lay something. A crystal. About the size of a fist. Warm even through the dead flesh. It glowed with a faint bluish light. Bren carefully carved it out and held it up to his eyes. The core. The manas. The most valuable thing in the beast. He looked at Dan and smiled broadly for the first time. On the way back, the two of them dragged the carcass together. They cut it into pieces right there in the woods. Dan showed Bren how to butcher it properly. Don't drag it back whole. Skin it right there. Separate the meat from the bones. Put it in a bag. Bury the entrails or leave them for the predators. Bren watched him silently and intently as he butchered the animal. Then he spoke a long sentence. Dan understood only 2 words. Where from? You know. He didn't answer. They returned to the village around noon. Bren walked ahead with a bag of meat on each shoulder. Dan carried the hide and the bones. They were spotted from the edge of the woods. A girl of about 7 ran out first. Then a boy. Then the women. Then an old man. When Bren dropped the sacks in the square and they opened up, everyone saw the meat. Dark. Red. A lot. A whole lot. The woman by the well, the very same one who had been crying on Dan's first day, stood there staring at the meat, and tears streamed down her face again. Only now they were different. That evening the village ate. Ate for real. Not bark and water. Not watery soup made from frozen turnips. Meat. Boiled. Grilled over coals. With hot broth. The children ate until their bellies swelled. The old man sat by the fire, chewing slowly and closing his eyes in pleasure. Bren sat next to Dan and talked. A lot. Fast. Dan understood 1 word out of every 5, but nodded. Bren patted him on the back and laughed. At night, when everyone had gone their separate ways, Dan sat by the dying fire in the square. The woman from the blacksmith's shop approached quietly. She sat down next to him. The boy was sleeping in her arms. His face was content and peaceful, for the first time in a long while, judging by how relaxed his features were. The woman looked at Dan. She said 3 words, slowly, so that he would understand. He understood. Liana. My name. She pointed to herself. Liana. Then she pointed to the boy. Tim. Dan pointed to himself. Dan. She nodded. She repeated it. Dan. Then she stood up and walked back to the blacksmith shop. At the doorway, she turned around. She looked at him across the square. Then she disappeared inside. Dan sat by the fire and thought about how, for the first time in 4 days, he had a name. Not a stranger. Not that one. Dan. The real work would begin in the morning. He knew that one hunt wouldn't be enough to get the village back on its feet. A system was needed. Bows were needed for the others. The right arrowheads were needed. He needed a smokehouse for the meat. He needed to keep track of supplies. He needed to figure out who in the village had what skills and put everyone in their place. He needed to do 10 things at once, and each one required time he didn't have. The first snow had already fallen. The real cold was still ahead. 4 months until spring. 4 months of hunger. Or 4 months of work. He chose work. For the next 2 weeks, Dan slept 4 hours a day. The rest of the time he worked. First, he set to work on the smokehouse. You couldn't eat all the meat from a bone-in deer in 2 days. It had to be preserved. In the village, there was only one way to preserve meat: hanging it out in the frost. It worked, but not very well. The frost didn't always hold. A thaw could come for a day or two, and the meat would start to spoil. Dan knew another method: smoking. A long, slow process over a low fire fueled by alder wood chips. 12 hours of smoke at a low temperature, and the meat could be stored for a month. He built the smokehouse in 2 days. He dug a pit, lined the walls with stone, covered the top with poles, and smeared it with clay. The chimney was made of turf. The firebox was set to the side so the smoke would stay cool. Bren helped dig. He didn't understand why, but he dug anyway. When the first batch of meat was hung on hooks inside and the smoke began to rise, Dan sat down on a rock and did the math. 300 kilograms of venison, minus the bones and hide, minus what was eaten right away. That left about 180 kilograms of lean meat. 25 people in the village. 300 grams per person per day. 24 days. Less than a month. Not enough. We need more. We need to hunt every week. But he hadn't made his second bow yet. His only bow was a prototype. Crude, functional, but a far cry from what he could make with proper materials. The horn was dried out. The glue was weak. The bowstring was stretching. The arrows were a bit crooked. 5 out of 10 shots hit where he aimed. On the other 5, the arrow veered a palm's width to the right. Dan knew why. The arrow's spine wasn't matched. The shaft's stiffness didn't match the bow's draw weight. The arrow would bend upon release and veer off course. In Portland, he could have fixed this in an hour. Here, the solution would take time. He needed straight shafts of uniform thickness. He needed a way to test their flexibility. He needed identical arrowheads. He needed an assembly line. He went to see Liana. By this time, he knew her name and knew that she was the blacksmith's widow, that her husband had died last winter, that she ran the smithy alone, that the village tolerated her because they needed the smithy, but no one brought her work if they could get by without it. In a widow, alone, with a child. In a village where a woman at the anvil is considered wrong and strange. Dan walked into the smithy and spoke the first long sentence he'd put together that evening by the fire. I need someone who understands metal. Do you understand? Let's work together. Liana stood by the forge with a hammer in her hand and looked at him as if he'd spoken in a language that doesn't exist. Then she set down the hammer. Slowly, carefully, the way one sets down a weapon. She asked what exactly he needed. He showed her a drawing. He'd been drawing with a stick on the hard-packed earthen floor of the smithy. An arrowhead. Narrow, long, 4-sided, and all. He poked his finger at the drawing and said he knew. Bone. To pierce. This one will pierce bone. Liana crouched down and looked at the drawing, then at Dan, then back at the drawing. She said that local arrowheads were flat, wide. They cut through soft tissue but bounce off bone armor. Everyone knows this. No one does anything about it. Dan nodded. He knew. A flat tip is a broadhead. A broadhead cuts through tissue and blood vessels. It's ideal against soft targets. Against a bony plate, it's useless. You need a bodkin, an awl. Narrow, heavy, with a small cross-section and high mass per unit area. Pressure equals force divided by area. Reduce the area and the pressure increases. Physics. Simple and ruthless. He explained it to Liana using his hands, fragments of words, and drawings on the floor. She listened. She didn't just listen. She asked questions. How long? How thick? What kind of iron? How to attach it to the shaft? She understood metal. Not the way he understood physics. Differently. More deeply. She knew how iron behaved under a hammer, how it sounded when it was ready, how it changed color at different temperatures. She knew this with her hands, not her head. And when Dan said that the arrowhead needed to be heated until it was red hot and then quickly plunged into water to harden it, she looked at him in surprise. Her husband did that with knives. But she didn't know you could do that with arrowheads, that it's called tempering, that after tempering, you need to temper it again, heat it again, but more gently, until it turns straw-colored, to remove the brittleness. So the arrowhead would be hard but not brittle. Liana spent 3 days making arrowheads. The first 5 were failures. Too thick, or too thin, or crooked or brittle. Each time, Dan would take a finished arrowhead and test it. He'd thrust it into a piece of bone he'd brought from the forest. If it bent, bad. If it broke, bad. If it went into the bone and held its shape, good. On the 6th try, Liana made a tip that went 2 fingers deep into the bone plate and didn't bend or break. She picked it up and held it up to the light. Then she looked at Dan. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was smiling, quietly, with just her lips, as if she'd forgotten how to smile long ago and was learning it all over again. That same day, Dan began making a second bow, not for himself, but for Brenna. He measured the length of Brenna's arms from the tips of his fingers to his chin. He asked Brenna to draw his bow and watched as he did so. Brenna was stronger than Dan, broader in the shoulders. His draw was longer. He needed a more powerful bow with longer limbs, a different bow. Not a copy, not a replica, a bow for Bren. Bren stood there watching as Dan measured his arms and jotted something down with a charcoal stick on a piece of bark. He said Dan was crazy. Then he said that no archer had ever made a bow for a specific person. A bow is a bow. It's the same for everyone. Dan said no. A bow is an equation. The archer's strength, the draw length, the arrow's weight, the distance to the target. Change one variable and the whole bow is different. Bren said Dan was definitely crazy, but he stayed put while Dan finished taking measurements. By the end of the 2nd week, 2 events took place in the village. First, Dan and Bren went hunting for the 2nd time and killed 2 beasts. Not a bone deer, a stone boar. The creature was shorter than a deer but broader, covered in plates that looked like gray stone. Slow, dull, vicious. Bren drove the first one toward Dan. An arrow with a bodkin tip pierced the boar's side beneath its front leg. Bren finished off the second one himself, with an old bow. 3 arrows into its unprotected belly as the boar reared up. There was more meat now. The smokehouse was in full swing. Their supply was growing. The second event was quieter. A girl approached Dan, young, dark-skinned, muscular, with a scar across her left eyebrow. She spoke quickly and forcefully, and Dan didn't catch everything, but he got the gist. She wanted to help. She knew how to count. She saw that he was writing something on pieces of bark, and she could do it better because she knew the letters. Dan asked her name. Kara Weston. She said she wasn't from around here, that she was from the southern province, that she had been a slave, that she had been bought and set free, that she had no papers, that she was stuck in the village, and the village tolerated her but didn't accept her. She said all this matter-of-factly, without self-pity, like a list of facts. Dan looked at her and saw a person who was used to the world hitting her and who had learned to hit back. He said he needed someone to keep track of things. How much meat, how many bones, how many hides, how many arrowheads, how many arrows, how many days' worth of supplies. Kara nodded. She said that was something she knew how to do. Then she asked how he would pay her. Dan said with food, an equal share, just like everyone else. Kara looked at him for a long time. Then she snorted. Then she said he was either a fool or a saint. Then she sat down next to him by the smokehouse and began writing down the numbers he dictated to her. Lines on the bark, sticks and dots. Her counting system was different, but the logic was the same. By evening, they had the first inventory of the village of Caro. For the first time in the history of this place, someone had recorded how much food there was and how long it would last. The numbers were grim. 25 mouths to feed. A 32-day supply of meat at the current rate of consumption. 20 days worth of grain. 10 days worth of roots and dried berries. 120 days until spring. A dire shortage. Dan looked at these numbers and did the math. 1 successful hunt per week. At least 200 kilograms of meat per trip. 16 hunts until spring. 3,200 kilograms of meat. Minus a 20% loss during smoking, 2,560. Divide by 120 days. Divide by 25 mouths to feed. 850 grams per person per day. That'll be enough. If every hunt is successful. If he doesn't break his bow. If no one gets sick. If the lord from the castle doesn't send men. If. Kara looked at his face and said he looked like a man who just realized there was a wall ahead. Dan said there wasn't a wall ahead. There's an equation ahead, with a great many variables. Kara said he was definitely a fool, but a fool who can do math is a rare and useful fool. Bren's bow was ready on the 20th day. longer than Dan's bow, wider at the shoulders, a draw weight of 60 pounds. Bren drew it back, and a strange expression crossed his face, as if he'd taken into his hands something he'd dreamed of, but didn't know was even possible. He shot at a tree at the edge of the clearing. The arrow whizzed through the air and sank into the trunk right up to the fletching. Bren stood there, staring at the tree. Then he looked at the bow. Then at Dan. He said that this bow was worth more than his house. Dan said that this bow was worth exactly as much as Bren's life, because the bow was made for his hands and no one else's. Bren fell silent. He wasn't used to hearing words like that. No one in this world made anything for just one person. Things were made for everyone, identical, average, belonging to no one. But this bow was his. The hunt would go faster this way. 2 bows, 2 archers. Bren knew the forest and the animals. Dan knew ballistics and weak spots. Together, they were more effective than any group of 5 hunters with old bows. In the 4th week, they killed 3 bone deer and 1 shadow wolf. The shadow wolf was different. Smaller than a deer but faster. Its pelt was dark, almost black. It had no bony plates but was as thick as leather armor. A regular arrow bounced off. A bodkin arrow penetrated but not deeply. Dan killed it with his second arrow. The first arrow struck its shoulder, and the wolf jerked and turned toward them. Its eyes glowed yellow in the twilight. The second arrow entered its open mouth and exited through the back of its head. Bren said that Dan was either the best archer he'd ever seen or the craziest. Dan said they were one and the same. The shadow wolf's pelt was worth a lot, Bren explained. In the cities, they make light armor out of it. Durable, flexible, more expensive than steel. The wolf's core was smaller than a deer's but denser, darker, with a violet sheen. Bren said that in the city, you could buy a horse for a core like that. Dan said they didn't need a horse. They needed metal. Good metal. For tips and tools. Bren said the nearest town, Crayvorn, was a 2-day journey to the south. There was a market there and merchants. But between the village and the town lay Lord Volt's lands. Dan remembered the name. Volt. On the 25th day, 2 events occurred that changed everything. In the morning, a girl approached Dan. Red-haired. Sharp-featured, with fists perpetually clenched and a gaze that made you want to take a step back. Ira Devlin. Dan knew about her. Bren had told him. Her father had been a poacher. He'd hunted on the Lord's lands without permission. He'd been caught and hanged 3 years ago. Ever since then, Ira had lived with the stigma of being a criminal's daughter. The village tolerated her, but no more than that. They gave her the dirtiest work. They didn't give her a say in anything. She could shoot better than half the men in the village. Everyone knew that. No one let her hunt. Because she was a woman. Because she was a thief's daughter. Because that's just the way it was. Ira walked up to Dan and said she wanted a bow. She didn't ask. She said it. Like a fact. Like a demand. Dan looked at her. He saw how she was standing. Feet shoulder-width apart. Her left shoulder slightly higher than her right. A habit. She shot left-handed. He asked if she'd ever shot his bow. She said no. But she shoots every day. With a homemade bow she made herself out of hazelwood. In secret. In the woods. Dan said, "Show me." She led him behind the shed. There, hanging on the wall, was a target made of bound straw. And in the corner stood a bow. Crooked. Rough. Carved from a single piece of hazelwood. Wrapped with rope in 3 places. Ugly. But it worked. Ira took the bow. She took her stance. She drew it back. She shot. The arrow flew crooked because the bow was crooked. But her hands were in the right position. Her grip was right. Her stance was right. Her draw was even. Her release was clean. Whoever taught this girl to shoot knew what they were doing. Or she'd taught herself, which was even more frightening. Dan looked at her and thought. Then he said the words that Bren later repeated to the whole village. "You're now the senior archer. Teach the others." Ira froze. She stood there with the bow in her hand, staring at him. Her face twitched. Just once. Quickly. Then she turned and walked away. Silently. Quickly. Almost running. Bren found her that evening behind the far barn. She was crouching with her face to the wall, sobbing, silently. Only her shoulders were shaking. Bren stood nearby. Then he silently sat down on a log and waited for her to finish. He didn't say anything. He was just there. When she stood up and wiped her face, he said one sentence. "The boy knows what he's doing." Era looked at him. Red eyes, wet cheeks, clenched fists. She nodded. The second incident happened that same evening. Dan was sitting by the stream on the edge of the village, whittling a piece of wood for Era's bow. He heard footsteps and looked up. A girl. A young one. Dark hair, huge eyes. Her hands were stained with something green, grass, or maybe dirt. She stood 5 steps away, staring at him without blinking. She didn't come closer. She didn't walk away. She just stood there. Dan said, "Hello?" She didn't answer. He waited. She didn't answer. He realized. She couldn't answer. She was mute. He remembered. Bren had mentioned it. There's a girl, a strange one. She doesn't speak. She walks into the woods alone. She gathers herbs. The village is afraid of her. They think she's cursed. May So-yun. Dan looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at his hands, at the way he was planing the wood, at the shavings falling onto the snow in golden curls, at the shape of the piece slowly emerging from the block of ash. She was watching the work, like someone who understands what it means to make something with their hands. Dan took a notebook out of his jacket pocket. Small, worn. The only thing from his world that had survived. Inside the notebook were his notes, bow calculations, drawings of arrowheads, formulas. He opened to a blank page. He took out a charcoal pencil he'd made from a stick charred in a furnace. He drew a flower, a simple one, 5 petals. He showed it to May. Then he gestured around them. "There's one like this here." May looked at the drawing, then at Dan. Then she stepped closer. She sat down beside him, carefully, like a wild animal that's decided you're not a threat. She took the stick and drew in the snow beside him. The same flower, only more precisely, with details, with veins on the petals, with the shape of the leaves. Then she pointed to the drawing and shook her head. "No, not in winter." Dan drew a different plant. She nodded. She pointed to the forest. He drew a third one. She nodded again. And she drew the root of that plant next to it. Long, twisted. Then she pressed her palm to her stomach and made a gesture. It helps. It heals. They sat by the stream and drew in the snow. He asked questions using gestures and drawings. She answered with gestures and drawings. 2 people who couldn't speak to each other had found a language without words. Half an hour later, Dan realized something. May knew more about the plants in this forest than anyone else in the village. She knew what healed and what harmed, what was edible and what was poisonous, which roots caused fever and which relieved it, which bark stopped bleeding. The herbalist who had raised May had passed everything on to her, everything she herself knew, and perhaps even more. May wasn't just a girl who gathered herbs. She was a pharmacy, a walking pharmacy who couldn't tell anyone what she knew because she couldn't speak. And the village hadn't bothered to ask. When Dan stood up and brushed the snow off his knees, May was still sitting where she was. She was looking at the notebook he was holding in his hand. Then she looked up, and tears were streaming down her face. Quiet. Clear. She didn't wipe them away. She was simply crying because, for the first time in a year, someone had sat down next to her and asked. Not with words, with gestures, with drawings, but he had asked. Dan stood there, not knowing what to say. He reached out and briefly squeezed her shoulder, gently, as if touching something that might break. Then he nodded to her and walked over to the smithy. That evening, he sat with Kara by the campfire, and they updated their records. Kara took notes. Dan dictated. Meat in the smokehouse, hides drying, bones to be processed, 2 arrowheads, for trade in town, 14 arrowheads ready, 20 arrows assembled, 2 working bows, a 3rd in progress for Era. Kara finished writing and looked at him. She asked why he was making a bow for a woman. Dan said it was because she shoots better than half the men. Kara said that wasn't an answer. The men won't let her hunt. The village won't accept her. That's not how it works. Dan said he didn't care how it worked. What mattered to him was how it should work. Kara looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly that he would either change this village or the village would devour him. There was no third option. Dan said he preferred the first option. Kara snorted. Then she said she did too. The night was cold. Dan lay in the shed, which by this time he had insulated as best he could. He'd stuffed the cracks with moss. He'd laid a thick layer of straw on the floor. He'd made a makeshift door out of sewn-together hides. It wasn't warm, but it was bearable. He lay there and thought. 25 days in the new world. One bow for himself, one for Brenna, one in the works for Ira, a smokehouse, a month's supply of meat, a blacksmith who makes arrowheads, an accountant who keeps the books, a herbalist who can heal, a hunter who's become a partner, an archer waiting for a bow, a little boy who brings him a piece of bread every morning and smiles, missing his 2 front teeth. This wasn't a plan. It was the beginning of a plan. He closed his eyes, and a second before falling asleep, he thought that tomorrow he needed to start setting traps, because hunting every week is good. But traps work while you sleep, and whoever works while you sleep is the best worker of all. The traps changed everything. Dan spent 2 days scouting animal trails with Brent. They found 7 regular routes within an hour's walk of the village. Bone deer used 2 of them. Stone boars used 3. Shadow wolves used the remaining 2. The animals were predictable. They followed the same paths day after day, like scheduled buses, like trains on rails. Dan knew this from the Oregon deer. A beast doesn't invent new paths if the old ones are safe. It follows its memory, out of habit, by the scent of its own tracks. Dan set the first trap on the stone boar's trail. A pit, a deep one, 1.5 times a man's height. At the bottom were sharpened ash stakes with hardened iron tips that Liana had forged the night before. Poles on top, branches on the poles, snow on the branches. The boar is heavy, 300 kilograms or more. The poles must snap under its weight. The stakes are meant to pierce its belly. A boar's belly has no stone plates. It's soft, vulnerable. Bren looked at the pit and shook his head. He said that pits are dug in war, not on a hunt. A hunter approaches the beast himself, with a bow, with a spear, face to face. That's how it's always been. Dan said it's always been that way because no one had come up with a better way. Bren said it wasn't a question of better or worse. It was a question of honor. Dan said nothing. He didn't argue about honor with a man who'd risked his life hunting his whole life. He just said, "Let's wait." On the 3rd day after the trap was set, a stone boar fell into the pit. A young one, about 200 kilograms. 2 stakes had pierced its belly. The beast was dead when they came to check. Bren stood at the edge of the pit and looked down. For a long time, in silence. Then he said one sentence. "Let's set up some more." By the end of the 5th week, they had 4 traps in operation along different trails. 2 pits, 1 crossbow trap on the Shadow Wolf's trail, 1 steel wire snare on the small game trail. The crossbow trap was Dan's pride and joy. A bow was secured to a frame between 2 trees. The bowstring was taut. An arrow with a bodkin was aimed across the trail. The trigger mechanism consisted of a rope stretched across the path at knee height. The wolf would brush against the rope. The rope would release a lever. The lever would release the bowstring. The arrow would strike the wolf in the side. Dan had braided the rope from tendons. He had carved the lever from hard ash wood. He made a separate crossbow. Rough, powerful, without fine-tuning, because accuracy at a distance of 3 steps isn't necessary. What's needed is power. The first shadow wolf was hit by the crossbow at night. In the morning, Dan and Bren found it on the trail with an arrow in its ribs. Dead. The hide was intact except for the entry wound. The arrowhead was still inside. The meat was edible, though tough. Bren no longer spoke of honor. He talked about where to set the 5th trap. Food was no longer a problem. Not entirely. But the worst was over. The children no longer looked like skeletons covered in skin. The women stopped crying by the well. The old village chief walked through the village, and for the first time in months, he wasn't slouching. The smokehouse was in use every day. The supply of meat hanging on the walls inside had grown to the point where Kara stopped counting days and started counting weeks. 6 weeks worth, then 7, then 8. Dan began to think about something else. About a bow for Era. He'd been working on it for 10 days already. Era was a different kind of archer. Not like Bren. Not like himself. Bren was all about strength. Powerful draw. A heavy arrow. A long-range shot. Dan was precision. Calculation. Ballistics. A shot to the weak spot. Era was speed. He watched her shoot from her ugly walnut bow. Fast. Very fast. Arrow on the string. Draw. Release. Next arrow. Draw. Release. 3 arrows in the time it took Bren to fire 1. Not all of them were accurate, but fast. In a fight against several beasts or against people, speed is more important than accuracy. Dan made her bow lighter than his own. 40-pound draw weight. The limbs were short and springy. The grip was thin, fitting her narrow palm. Her left shoulder was slightly weaker than her right, because her left hand was weaker. He noticed this on the first day. She didn't know he'd noticed. When the bow was ready, he called her over to the target behind the shed. She came. Silently. With a stony expression. She took the bow. Looked at it. Turned it over in her hands. Raised it. Drawn the string. Her eyes changed. Something in them flickered. She shot. The arrow flew straight. Right where she was aiming. No drift to the right, no wobble. Straight. She shot a second one. Right next to the first. A third. In a line. A fourth. A fifth. 5 arrows in the target, a palm's width apart from each other. She lowered the bow and stood there. Just stood there. Then she looked up at Dan and he saw something in her eyes that made him uneasy. Not tears. Not joy. Rage. The quiet white rage of a person who realized how many years had been stolen from her. How many years had she been shooting with that crooked stick, thinking she was a mediocre archer? But she was the best. It was just that the bow wasn't hers. She said one word. Thank you. But that word didn't sound like gratitude. It sounded like a vow. Dan nodded. He knew that feeling. He'd seen it in people who were given the right tool for the first time. An archer with a bad bow thinks the problem lies with him. Give him the right bow and he'll realize the problem was always with the bow. And that realization more painful than any blow. Ira left with the bow. She didn't return until evening. Bren said she'd been shooting in the woods until dark. All her arrows. Then she'd gather them up. Then she'd shoot again. Then she'd gather them up again. She came back when it was dark. Silently. With scraped fingers. With cheeks red from the cold. She walked over to Dee, who was sitting by the fire, and said that tomorrow she was going hunting. She didn't ask. She stated it. Dan looked at Bren. Bren shrugged. Dan said, "All right." In the morning, the 3 of them set out. Dan, Bren, Era. Their first hunt with 3 archers. Brenna walked in front, Dan in the middle. Ira brought up the rear. She moved through the forest more quietly than Brenna. Quieter than Dan. She knew this forest as well as any old hunter. Maybe even better. She'd been coming here in secret for 3 years. Every day. She knew the trees, the rocks, the streams, the ravines. Places where the snow was deep and places where the crust held firm. Bren noticed it first and looked at her with an expression that Dan didn't immediately decipher. Respect. Heavy. Reluctant. But genuine. They found a herd of bone deer by a frozen stream. 5 of them. 2 large males, 3 smaller females. Without bony growths on their backs. Their hides were softer. More vulnerable. Dan gave the signal. Bren took the left male. Dan took the right one. Era took the females. 3 shots, almost simultaneously. Bren hit the joint behind the shoulder blade. His deer took 2 steps and fell. Dan hit it cleanly. His deer fell on the spot. Era. Era fired 3 times while Dan was reloading. 3 arrows. 3 females. 2 fell immediately. The third ran off and fell 20 steps away. Bren stood with his mouth agape. Dan stood with his mouth agape. Era stood with her bow in hand, her face calm. Absolutely calm. Like someone who had finally found her place. 5 carcasses. Over a ton of meat. antlers, hides. 3 carcasses from large animals. They couldn't carry it all away in one go. They returned to the village for help. Bren walked along telling everyone he met. 3 arrows, 3 deer. The girl Devlin. The men listened and said nothing. Some looked away. Some looked at Ira. She walked, looking straight ahead, her face showing nothing but calm. That evening by the campfire, Kara updated her records. The meat supply had grown to 10 weeks. 10 weeks, 2.5 months. There were roughly that many weeks left until spring. For the first time, the numbers added up. For the first time, it looked as though Caro Village would survive this winter. Kara looked at her records and said quietly that if someone had told her 3 months ago that she'd be sitting by the fire in a destitute village, rejoicing over 10 weeks' worth of dried meat, she would have laughed right in that person's face. But now it wasn't funny. Now it was the best thing that had ever happened in her life. Dan looked at her. Kara looked away. Quickly, abruptly. Like someone who had said more than they meant to. On the 42nd day, the tax collector arrived in the village. He rode in on horseback. With him were 2 soldiers in leather jackets with insignia. Lord Volt's coat of arms. A red shield with a black boar. The collector was short, round-faced, with oily eyes and a smile that meant nothing. He dismounted in the middle of the square and looked around. Dan saw his gaze linger on the smokehouse, on the bundles of meat hanging on the walls, at the hides stretched out on frames to dry, at the bones neatly stacked by the blacksmith shop, at the order that hadn't existed here before. The collector approached the village elder. They spoke for a long time. Dan stood in the doorway of the blacksmith shop and listened. He already understood almost everything. 2 months learning the language. New words every day. Every evening, conversations with Bren and Kara. The language seeped into him like water into dry earth. Quickly, eagerly, unstoppably. The collector spoke of the tax, the quota, the winter levy. So much meat, so many hides, so many bones. 1 meatball if available. The village head nodded. The tax collector continued. This year the quota has been doubled. The Lord's order. Winter is harsh. The castle needs more. The village must give twice as much as usual. The village head stopped nodding. He stood there in silence. His face turned gray. A double quota meant giving up half of their supplies. Half of what they'd stockpiled over 6 weeks of hunting. 5 weeks worth of meat. Out of 10. Back to the brink. Back to hunger. Back to fear. Dan stepped out of the smithy. He approached the collector and the village headman. The collector looked down at him, even though he was half a head shorter. He asked who it was. The village elder said, "A hunter. A new one. A stranger." The collector looked at Dan more closely. At his jacket. Strange. Foreign. At his hands, calloused from the bowstring. At the bow on his back. Short. Unfamiliar. He asked where he was from. Dan said, "From far away." The collector didn't press him for details. He was interested in something else. He pointed to the smokehouse and asked how much meat there was. Dan gave a figure, the full amount, an honest one. The collector raised his eyebrows. Then he looked at the village headman, then back at Dan. The village of Caro had never had this much meat by midwinter before. It was 3 times as much as last year. The collector knew that. Dan saw interest flare up in his oily eyes. Not a friendly kind, but a calculating one. Dan said the village would pay double the quota. The village head flinched. Dan placed a hand on his shoulder, lightly, reassuringly. He said the village would pay double the quota and, on top of that, send the Lord a gift. A shadow wolf pelt. The collector blinked. A shadow wolf pelt was worth so much that his annual salary could fit inside it 3 times over. Dan walked into the smithy and brought out the pelt. Black. Soft. Without a single tear except for a neat slit across the belly. Tanned. Bren and Liana had helped him prepare it for 3 days. It was beautiful. Even the collector, who had seen such hides draped over Lord's shoulders, couldn't hide his admiration. Dan handed over the hide. He handed over the meat. He handed over the bones. The collector loaded everything onto a pack horse. He rode off, looking back. Twice. 3 times. He looked at the village the way one looks at a place they need to remember. When the hoofbeats faded behind the trees, The village elder turned to Dan. He was angry. His eyes were small and mean. He said that Dan had given away too much, that the pelt was worth a fortune, that he could have paid the usual rate and the collector would have swallowed it. Dan shook his head. He said that if he had paid the usual rate, the collector would have left angry. An angry collector is a problem. He would have reported to the Lord that the village was being defiant, that it was refusing to pay double, that there was some outsider there. The Lord would have sent soldiers instead of a collector. But this way, the collector would leave satisfied. More than satisfied. He would leave with a gift that would show the Lord that the village was loyal and wealthy. The Lord doesn't touch what brings profit. The Lord only interferes with what resists him. The village head listened. Kara stood nearby and listened too. She nodded. Slowly. She understood. She had grown up in the South, where trade and politics were one and the same. She understood the language of power and money better than anyone in the village. The village elder left unconvinced but not angry. He was old and wise in the sense that he knew how to change his mind without losing face. He simply left. Kara stayed. She looked at Dan and said that the pelt was a good move, but the Lord would still take an interest. A village that suddenly pays 3 times as much is a village that has something. And whatever the village has, the Lord considers his own. Dan said he knew. Kara said he had a plan. Dan said he had the beginning of a plan. Kara said that the beginning of a plan was more than she'd had in the last 3 years. That evening, Dan gathered those he trusted. Bren, Liana, Kara, and Ira. May sat in the corner and listened. She didn't speak, but she understood every word. Dan could see it in her eyes. He said the village needed to enter the market. On its own. Not through the Lord. Not through his tax collectors and merchants. On its own. To take meat, hides, bones, and kernels to Cravorn and sell them directly. Bren said the road ran through Volt's lands. A trade caravan wouldn't be allowed to pass without permission. Kara said that permission could be obtained. In Cravorn, there are merchants who operate under a royal charter. A royal charter takes precedence over the Lord. If the village entered into a contract with such a merchant, the Lord wouldn't be able to prohibit the trade. Formally. In reality, he could do a lot. But formally, no. Dan asked how to find such a merchant. Kara smiled. For the first time ever, he saw her smile genuinely. Not a smirk. Not a snarl. A smile. She said she knew one. From the South. An old acquaintance. He transports goods throughout Villain and has a charter. She said she'd write to him. If he's still alive. If he's still trading. If he remembers her. Dan asked how to send the letter. Kara said that once a month, a mail wagon leaves for Cravorn from the neighboring village of Hawkmere, a half-day's walk to the east. If they made it in time for the next wagon, the letter would arrive in 2 weeks. Dan nodded. Nora. He remembered her because he needed someone who knew how to write. Nora Keeling, the village headman's daughter. 20 years old, a blonde braid, a book under her arm. He saw her every day but never spoke to her. She would look at him from a distance, always from a distance, like someone who wants to approach him but can't bring themselves to do so. The next morning, Dan was sitting by the smokehouse, talking aloud to Kara about how they needed to keep records differently. Not with sticks and dots on bark, but with letters. A proper record keeping. How much went out? How much came in? Who it was given to? When? Why? So that you could look at it a month later and understand what was going on. He was talking and saw Nora out of the corner of his eye. She was standing around the corner of the smokehouse listening. She thought he couldn't see her. He could. He kept talking. A minute later, Nora came around the corner. She said quietly but firmly that she knew how to write. Dan looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. He said he needed someone to take notes. Nora said she could do it. Dan said, "Then I need you." Nora stood there, her cheeks flushed, not from the cold. An hour later, she was sitting at a table in the blacksmith shop with a quill that Dan had carved from a goose's wing and ink that May had made from some berries and soot. She wrote, quickly, neatly. The letters were even. The lines were straight. Kara dictated the numbers. Nora wrote them down. Dan watched them and thought that 2 women at a table taking notes was the beginning of bookkeeping. and bookkeeping was the beginning of civilization. Then he thought that this idea was too pretentious for a guy from Portland, and he almost laughed. The letter left with the wagon train from Hawkmire 3 days later. Kara wrote it herself. She dictated it to Nora, and Nora wrote it down. The recipient was a merchant named Torin Hell. Kara didn't go into details about how they'd met. Dan didn't ask. From the way she dictated it and the care with which she chose her words, he realized there had been something between them. Not love. Something else. A duty. Or gratitude. Or both. They waited 2 weeks for a reply. During those 2 weeks, several things happened. First, Ju Barlow burst into Dan's life like a rock smashing through a window. Quickly and with a crash. Ju was 18 years old. She was the younger sister of Hart Barlow, one of the village's 4 remaining hunters. Petite. Wiry. Always dressed in men's clothes. Her hair was cut short. Her hands were scratched from climbing trees. She knew the forest as well as Dan knew his bow. Every tree, every ravine, every stream, every burrow of every animal within a 2-hour walk of the village. She came to Dan that morning and said she wanted to be a scout. Dan asked what she could do. She listed her skills: climb trees, move silently through the woods, read tracks, find animal resting places, find water in winter, know which snow is deep enough to walk on and which isn't, find your way in a blizzard. Dan asked how she knew all this. She said she'd been going into the woods since she was 5, first with her brother, then alone. Her brother stopped to take her with him when she turned 12 because a girl didn't belong in the woods. She kept going on her own, in secret, just as Ira shot in secret, just as May gathered herbs in secret. All the women in this village lived in secret. They did what they knew how to do when no one was watching. Dan said, "All right, show me." They went into the forest. Ju walked ahead, and Dan couldn't hear her footsteps. At all. She moved among the trees the way an animal that had grown up here moves. She placed her feet precisely. She didn't touch the branches. The snow didn't crunch under her feet because she was walking on packed snow, not loose snow. She knew where the crust held firm. In 2 hours, she showed Dan 3 animal trails that not even Bren knew about. A shadow wolf's den among the roots of a huge spruce. A watering hole where deer came at dawn. And something else. A clearing deep in the forest. Small. Round. A stone stood in the clearing. Large. Gray. With some kind of markings on its surface. Faded by time but still visible. Lines. Circles. Something like letters that Dan couldn't read. Ju said there were several such stones in the forest. The elders say these are traces of the ancients. Those who lived here before humans. Or not before humans, but before the kingdom. No one knows for sure. Children scare each other with stories about a temple deep in the forest, a place from which no one returns. Dan stood by the stone and traced the markings with his fingers. The lines were smooth, polished, not by a chisel, with something else. He didn't know what, but the stone was strange, warm. In the middle of winter in the forest, at -20, the stone felt warm to the touch. He pulled his hand away. He looked at Ju. She was staring at him without blinking. Then she said he was the first person she'd ever shown this place to. Then she blushed and turned away. Then she walked back toward the village very quickly, without looking back. Dan followed her and thought that 18-year-old girls were the same in any world. The second thing that happened was more serious. May. Dan worked with her every evening. They developed a system. He drew plants in his notebook. She gestured what to do with them. He took notes. Gradually, the notebook filled up. Herbs for wounds. Herbs for fever. Herbs for stomach aches. Bark for pain. Roots for sleep. May knew hundreds of recipes, combinations, proportions. All of this was in her head and nowhere else. If anything happened to her, the knowledge would be lost. Dan wrote everything down. But one evening, something strange happened. They were sitting in the smithy. Liana was working at the forge. Tim was sleeping in the corner on some animal skins. May was showing Dan a new root, a long one, white. It looked like a carrot but had a bitter smell. She explained with gestures that it shouldn't be boiled whole, but cut into thin rings. Then she froze. She simply stopped in the middle of a gesture. Her eyes went blank, as if she were looking through the wall, somewhere far away. Dan called out to her. She didn't respond. Liana turned away from the horn. May stood motionless for about 10 seconds. Then she opened her mouth. A sound burst from her throat. Not a word, not a whisper. Something in between. Hoarse, low. A sound like that shouldn't have come from a 19-year-old girl. It sounded like a very old voice struggling through a very thick wall. Then she blinked. Her eyes returned. She looked at Dan in alarm. She looked at her hands. Then at the root she was holding. She didn't understand what had happened. Dan didn't ask any questions. He just sat down next to her and kept drawing, as if nothing had happened. May watched him and gradually relaxed, but Dan remembered. He remembered that sound. And he remembered that May herself didn't know what had happened. That was the first thing. There would be more to come. He didn't know that then, but he sensed it. Something was changing, not in the village, in the forest. The third thing. Hunting was getting harder. Not because there were fewer animals. On the contrary, there were more animals. But they had changed. Larger, more aggressive. In the 7th week, Bren and Dan came upon a bone deer trail and found tracks that hadn't been there before. Huge. Wider than a dinner plate. Deep. The beast that left these tracks weighed twice as much as a normal bone deer. Bren crouched down by the tracks and was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd seen tracks like these only once in his life. 20 years ago. When he was a boy. Back then, a beast emerged from the depths of the forest, one the elders called the king of the herd. Huge, old, with 10-tiered antlers, with bone plates as thick as a palm. That beast killed 2 hunters and went back into the forest. No one could take it down. The king hadn't returned since then, until now. Bren straightened up and looked at Dan. He said that the forest was changing, that the beasts were getting bigger, that the old hunters had been talking about this for 3 years, but no one had listened. That a bone deer the size of a horse used to be a rarity, but now it's the norm. That shadow wolves used to roam alone, but now they travel in packs of 3 or 5. That stone boars used to never come closer to the village than an hour's walk, but now their tracks are found within half an hour. Dan listened. He thought about the warm stone in the clearing, about the signs he couldn't decipher, about the sound that had burst from May's throat, about how the temple deep in the forest might not just be a children's boogeyman story. He told Bren that they needed to be more careful. Bren snorted and said he'd been careful every day for the past 25 years. Dan said he needed to be careful in a different way, not just watching his step, but looking further ahead, deep into the forest, to where the plate-sized tracks were coming from. Bren looked at him, and for the first time, Dan saw something resembling fear in his eyes. Not for himself, for the village, for the people he'd known his whole life and fed his whole life, for the world he understood and that had suddenly begun to change. The reply from Torin, Hell, came on the 61st day. The merchant's letter was brief. He remembers Kara. He's willing to discuss the contract. He'll be in Cravorn in 3 weeks. If the village wants to trade directly, let them send a representative with samples of their goods. Kara read the letter and looked at Dan. She said she'd go herself. Dan said he'd go with her. Kara said the road was dangerous. A 2-day journey through the lands of Volta, through the forest, across open fields where they might encounter bandits or the Lord's patrol. Dan said that was exactly why he would go with her. They set out on the 65th day. Dan, Kara, and Ira. Ira volunteered herself. She said 2 bows were better than 1. Dan didn't argue. They carried a bag of samples, 3 cores, a bundle of bodkins, a piece of tanned shadow wolf hide, and a bow. The 3rd bow Dan had made. Not for anyone in particular. For sale. A demonstration piece. To show a merchant what it was and what it was for. The journey took 2 days, just as Bren had said. The first day through the forest. Cold. Quiet. Ira walked ahead, and Dan was once again struck by the way she moved. Silently. Alert. Bow at the ready. Arrow knocked. She didn't let her guard down for a single second. They spent the night by a campfire in a ravine. Ira was on watch first. Dan second. Kara third. Kara didn't sleep during her shift. She sharpened her knife. Dan asked why. She said it was a habit. The second day was open. Fields. A road. Villages. They saw Cravorn by evening. A town. A real town. Stone walls, towers, an oak gate reinforced with iron. Smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys. Noise. People. Lots of people. More than Dan had seen in 2 months. The guard at the gate looked at them indifferently. 3 ragged country bumpkins with a sack. Nothing interesting. They let them through without asking any questions. The city hit Dan with its smell. Smoke. Manure. Sweat. Roasted meat. Leather. Urine. Iron. All mixed together. After the clean, frosty air of the forest, the city smelled like a garbage dump and a festival all at once. Kara led the way. She knew cities. She moved through the crowd with ease and confidence. She ducked into an alley, then into another. Then they emerged onto a square lined with rows of stalls. Cravorn was a trading city. The market took up a third of the square. Stalls, tents, carts. Goods spread out on animal hides right on the ground. Meat, bones, hides. Shells locked away in wooden boxes. Weapons, armor, fabrics, potions in murky bottles. Dan walked and looked around. He looked at the bows. Local bows were sold in the weapons row. Long ones. Made from a single piece of yew. No composite. No layers. Just a stick with a string. Prices ranged from 3 silver pieces to 10 for a good one. He picked one up. The vendor let him. Dan bent it. Weak. Draw weight 25 pounds. Maybe 30. It wouldn't pierce a bone plate even with a bodkin. He put the bow back. The salesman asked if he didn't like it. Dan said nothing. Then they found Torin Hell. The merchant turned out to be a thin, wiry man in his 50s with a gray beard and a sharp gaze. He saw Kara and was silent for a few seconds. Then he said one word. Alive. Kara said, alive. They sat down at a corner table in the tavern. Torin drank diluted wine. Kara drank water. Dan and Ira ate. Their first hot meal in a tavern after 2 days on the road. Dan laid the samples out on the table. Bullets, daggers, the hide. Torin looked at them. For a long time, intently. He picked up each item, turned it over, felt it, sniffed the hide. He tested the bodkin with his fingernail and whistled softly. He said the bodkin was good, better than anything he'd seen from the city blacksmiths. Harder, thinner, smoother. Dan said thank you. Then he took out the bow. Thorin looked at the bow, then at Dan, then back at the bow. He took it in his hands, and Dan saw that the merchant knew what a weapon was. Thorin tried to bend the limb. His eyes widened. He tried harder. The limb gave way with resilience and power and sprang back like a spring. He looked at the layers. Wood, horn, tendon. He ran his finger along the glue joint. He said he'd never seen anything like it, that he'd seen horn bows among the southern nomads, but those were crude, thick. This one was different. This one was slender and powerful. How was it made? Dan said, the master's secret. Thorin smiled. He understood. A master's secret isn't for sale. They haggled for 3 hours. Kara led the negotiations. Dan sat and listened, chiming in when a technical detail needed explaining. Era remained silent all evening, staring at the tavern's front door. She couldn't relax even in the city. The contract was as follows. Torin would handle the transportation. He'd come to Hawkmere once a month, pick up the goods. He'd take it to Cravorn, and then further south. He'd sell it in his own name under a royal charter. The village would receive 70% of the sale. Torin would get 30. Kara had started by asking for 75. Torin had haggled it down to 60. They settled on 70. Kara said Thorin was soft. Thorin said Kara was a bitch. Both were smiling. They wrote the contract on parchment. Thorin affixed his seal. Kara made a cross because she didn't have a seal. Dan signed his name. Torin looked at his signature and said the letters were strange. Dan said, different school. Before leaving, Torin added one more thing. He said the bow wouldn't just interest him. He said there was a branch of the Hunters Guild in Cravorn. These were serious people. They controlled the production and sale of hunting weapons in major cities. If the bow hits the market, the guild will notice, and they'll come asking questions. Dan said, "Let them come." Torin shook his head. He said that Dan didn't understand. The guild doesn't ask. The guild takes it. Or the guild destroys it. There's no third option. They returned to Cairo on the 68th day. Dan walked and thought. The lord on one side, the guild on the other. The village in the middle. Small. Starving. With 30 residents and 3 crowers. And with a master who knows how to make bows the likes of which this world has never seen. He walked and thought, not noticing that Ira was walking beside him and looking at him from the side. Intently. Silently. The way one looks at a person they're beginning to see in a new light. The first caravan left on the 75th day. 20 kilograms of smoked meat, 10 tanned hides, 50 bodkins, 6 cannonballs, 1 bow for sale. Torin picked up everything in Hawkmere as agreed. He paid a deposit in silver, real silver. The coins lay on the table in the smithy, and Liana looked at them as one might look at something impossible. She said her husband hadn't earned that much in a year of working in the smithy. Dan said this was just the beginning. He divided it up. Part of it went toward metal, good metal. Not the soft iron Liana had been forging until now, but real steel. He explained to Liana what he needed. Iron mixed with carbon. Not just a chunk of ore re-melted in a furnace, but iron that had been buried in coal dust at a high temperature long enough for the carbon to seep into the surface. Carburization. He explained this for 3 evenings in a row. Liana listened. She didn't understand the word carbon. She didn't know what carburization was. But she understood metal. She understood that iron comes in different kinds. That one piece is hard and another is soft. That one holds its edge while another dulls in a day. She knew this through her hands. Dan gave her the theory to go along with what she knew from practice. When the first piece of case-hardened iron came out of the furnace, and Liana quenched it in water, then tempered it until it turned a straw-like color, and then tried it with a file, and the file slid off without leaving a mark. She looked up at Dan. There was something new in her eyes. Not just respect, not just gratitude. The recognition of one master by another. She said this steel was the best she'd ever seen in her life. Dan said it wasn't steel, not yet anyway. Real steel requires higher temperatures and more precise control. But it was a step. A big step. They began making new arrowheads from this metal. The arrowheads became thinner, lighter, harder. They didn't bend when striking a bone plate. They pierced right through. Cleanly, deeply, deadly. Liana made 10 of them a day. By the end of the 3rd month, they had 120 arrowheads, more than the entire village had used in 5 years. Some of the silver went toward cloth, toward grain, on salt, on things the village couldn't produce itself. Torin brought everything on his 2nd visit and picked up a new shipment of goods. He said the bows were selling well. Very well, in fact. He sold the first bow to a hunter from a neighboring village for a price that made Kara's eye twitch. 15 gold pieces. A stick bow cost 10 silver pieces. 15 gold pieces is 45 times more expensive. Thorin said that the buyer had been shooting the bow in the tavern courtyard and after the 3rd arrow offered to pay any price. Thorin named 15. The buyer paid without haggling. Thorin also said that people from the guild had seen the bow. The guild master asked to take a closer look. Thorin allowed it. The master took the bow apart. He removed the bowstring. He examined the layers. He tried to figure out how the horn and tendon were glued together. He couldn't figure it out. He tried to separate the horn plate from the wood. The glue held. He heated the bow's shoulder over a candle. The glue softened. He separated the plate. He examined the surface of the wood beneath it. He saw the notches Dan had made for better grip. He didn't understand why. He tried to put it back together. He couldn't. The glue had cooled unevenly. The plate sat crooked. The bow's shoulder lost its symmetry. The bow was now useless. The guildmaster stood there with the disassembled bow in his hands, and an expression that Thorin described as that of a man who had opened a box only to find a riddle inside. Dan listened to this and said nothing. He knew that sooner or later this would happen. A composite bow is no secret. It's technology. Technology can be stolen. It can be copied. It can be banned. The question is, which will happen first? Torin said that the guildmaster had asked who made the bow. Torin didn't say. Not yet, but he wouldn't be able to keep quiet for long. The guild has the right to ask, and the guild doesn't like it when it isn't answered. Kara sat nearby and listened. After Torin left, she said that the clock was ticking. Lord Volt knows that the village is getting richer. The guild knows that someone is making impossible bows. Sooner or later, these two pieces of information will come together. And then it won't be tax collectors or craftsmen who come to the village. Soldiers will come. Dan said he knew. Kara asked what the plan was. Dan said the plan was simple: to become so useful that destroying them would be more expensive than putting up with them. Kara said that wasn't a plan. It was hope. Dan said that as long as hope worked, he'd use it. Meanwhile, something else was happening. May. Ever since that evening in the smithy, strange things had been happening again and again. Not every day, once a week, sometimes less often. She would freeze for a few seconds. Her eyes would go blank. Then she'd come back. Sometimes that same hoarse sound would escape her throat. Sometimes it wouldn't. Dan recorded every instance, the date, the time, what she'd been doing beforehand, and how long it lasted. He noticed a pattern. The episodes occurred more often when May was working with certain plants, the ones that grew deeper in the forest, closer to the places where Ju found the warm stones. He told Bren about this. Bren listened in silence. Then he told a story he'd heard from his grandfather, a long time ago, when Bren was a boy. His grandfather said that deep in the forest there was a place, old, ancient, a temple or not, but something built by hands that weren't quite human. His grandfather said that sometimes a hum comes from there, a low hum, the kind you don't hear with your ears but feel in your bones. The last time he heard that hum was when he was young. Then it stopped. Bren said that 3 years ago, the animals began to change. And 3 years ago, people from distant hunting parties started saying that something glowed in the forest at night. Far away. Deep inside. Blue. Like a huge seed. Only seeds don't come that big. Dan listened and pieced the fragments together. Warm stones. Strange signs. Beasts that grow. Seeds that get bigger. May, who falls into a trance next to the plants from the depths of the forest. Something was awakening there in the thicket. Something older than the village, older than the kingdom. Something that was transforming the beasts and drawing toward May like a magnet draws iron. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know why. He only knew that he couldn't ignore it. But first, the village. People first. Food and warmth and walls and weapons first. Then the secrets. On the 80th day, Dan began teaching them to shoot. Not Era. Era already shot better than most of the hunters he'd known in his past life. He began teaching the women. Liana, Kara, Nora, Ju, May. Liana shot slowly but accurately. A blacksmith's hands are strong. Her grip was firm. She lacked fluidity. She pulled the bowstring with a jerk, just like she swung a hammer. Dan showed her. Smoothly, evenly, without a jerk. She got the hang of it in 3 days. Kara shot the way she did everything, fast and brazenly. Half her arrows went into the milk, half hit the target. She lacked patience. Dan said that archery isn't like business. You can't bluff here. An arrow flies where you send it, not where you wanted it to go. Kara snapped back. Then she fell silent. Then she hit 3 out of 5. Nora shot surprisingly well, quietly, with focus, with the same precision she used when she wrote. Every shot was deliberate. Every shot was better than the last. She wasn't fast, but she learned faster than anyone else. Ju shot the way she lived, impulsively, passionately, with fire in her eyes. She'd miss and laugh. She'd hit the target and scream. She wasn't the best, but she was the most alive. May. May picked up the bow and looked at it for a long time. Then she raised it, drawn the string. She shot. She missed. She shot again. She hit the target. Not in the center, on the edge, but she hit it. She lowered the bow and looked at her hands, then at Dan. There was surprise in her eyes, as if she hadn't expected that from herself. Dan smiled and gave her a thumbs up, a gesture he'd brought back from another world. May didn't know what it meant, but she understood. 7 archers. Dan, Brenna, Ira, Liana, Kara, Nora, Ju. May was the 8th, but she needed more time. 7 archers, 3 men, 4 women. In a world where a woman with a bow is nonsense, the men of the village were watching. Some were silent, some were grumbling. One of the hunters, Matt Kovac, walked up to Dan and said that women with bows were a disgrace, that the village would become a laughingstock, that the men wouldn't stand for it. Dan looked at him. Matt was short, wiry, with narrow eyes and thin lips, the kind of person who smiles when he's angry. Dan said that Ira shoots better than Matt. Matt said that was a lie. Dan said they could test it. Right now. A target. 5 arrows. Whoever hits the mark more accurately. Matt looked at Ira. Ira stood 10 paces away with her bow, staring at him. Her face was stony. Her eyes were cold. Matt spat and walked away. He didn't shoot. He knew he'd lose. And he never forgave Dan for that. Dan watched him walk away and felt a chill between his shoulder blades. Not from the cold. From that feeling you get when you know the person next to you hates you. Quietly, patiently, and waiting for the right moment. On the 91st day, Lord Volt's guard unit arrived. 10 soldiers, the commander, all on horseback, leather armor with insignia, swords, spears. They rode into the village as if they owned the place. The commander dismounted in the middle of the square and announced that the detachment would set up camp to protect the village from the increasingly dangerous beasts. By Lord Volt's order. Out of concern. For free. For free meant the village would have to feed them. 10 healthy men. Each one eats for 2. 20 portions a day from the supplies Dan had been stockpiling for 3 months. Kara did the math in her head and quietly told Dan that at that rate, the supplies would last 4 weeks instead of 8. Dan didn't argue with the commander. He didn't protest. He didn't threaten. He did something else. He invited the commander into the blacksmith's shop, seated him at the table, poured him some hot broth, and placed a piece of paper in front of him. The paper was a contract with Torrin Hall, under a royal charter, bearing the seal of a First Guild merchant. The commander read slowly. He traced his finger along the lines. He moved his lips. Then he looked up. Dan explained calmly. The village of Caro has a trade contract under a royal charter. The charter grants the right to free trade without interference from local lords. Any action that hinders trade under the charter is a violation of the royal decree. The presence of an armed detachment that is depleting the village's supplies hinders trade. Formally, legally, by law. The commander looked at Dan. Then at the paper. Then back at Dan. He wasn't stupid. He was a soldier following orders. But he understood that a dispute over the royal charter wasn't a dispute with the village. It was a dispute with the crown. And a dispute with the crown was beyond his level. He said he would report to the lord. Dan nodded. He said that the village of Caro would gladly welcome the lord's guests, but for just 1 day. As guests, not for a stay. With food and a warm place to sleep. Let the lord know that the village remembers his kindness. The commander left the next morning, with a full stomach, a bag of smoked meat for the road, and the look of a man who realized that the small village on the edge of the forest had become something else. Kara stood in the square and watched the detachment depart. She turned to Dan and said that the charter wouldn't last forever. The Lord would find a way to get around it, or find a reason to revoke it, or simply come in by force and spit on the law. Because the law is just paper, and paper burns. Dan said he knew. Kara said that in that case, they needed to prepare. Not for trade, for defense. Dan said he was already preparing. For the next 3 weeks, he worked on what he called to himself a defense system. Though he never spoke those words aloud. Traps around the village. Not hunting traps, combat traps. Pits with stakes on the trails leading to the village. Ropes stretched between trees at a rider's knee height. Crossbows aimed at the approaches. Barrier strips made of felled trees with sharpened branches. He didn't do this alone. Aira helped choose the positions. Ju showed the trails along which one could approach unnoticed. Bren dug the pits and chopped down the trees. Liana forged the tips for the stakes. Nora drew up a diagram of the trap's layout so that their own people wouldn't get caught. Kara calculated how much material was needed and where to get it. May went into the forest and gathered specific roots. Dan asked why. She demonstrated with gestures. The root was poisonous. If you rubbed the tip of a stake with the sap from this root, the wound would become inflamed twice as fast. It wouldn't kill. But a fighter with an inflamed wound is no fighter. Dan looked at her. May looked back calmly. There was neither anger nor fear in her dark eyes. Only Kalamata, the quiet, precise calculation of someone who knows what survival means. He nodded. They got to work. Meanwhile, Dan made a fourth bow, for Nora. Lightweight. Accurate. With minimal draw weight because Nora wasn't strong, but she was accurate. She didn't need Brenna's power or Ira's speed. She needed the ability to stand on the roof and hit a specific spot 50 paces away. She could do it. He'd seen it during training. He made the fifth bow for Kara. Medium. Versatile. Kara wasn't the best archer, but she was the kind of person who wouldn't run. Ever. Under any circumstances. Someone who stands their ground with a bow is worth more than an excellent archer who might falter. The sixth bow was for Ju. Small, light, fast. Just like her. Ju wouldn't stand on the wall. Ju would run between positions, pass on signals, fetch arrows, and if she needed to shoot on the run, she knew how. She was the worst shot out of the 7, but she moved better than any of the 30. The seventh bow. For May. He made it last. May didn't shoot much. Her hands were those of a herbalist, not an archer. But she needed the bow. Not for battle. So she could stand alongside the others and hold it in her hands. So she could be part of the line, so she would know she wasn't alone. When he handed her the bow, May took it with both hands and pressed it to her chest. Like a child. She didn't cry. She stood there holding the bow, and there was something in her eyes that made Dan's throat tighten. Acceptance. Belonging. For the first time in her life, she'd been given something that meant she belonged. 7 bows. 7 women. 7 archers on the rooftops when the day comes. And the day will come. Dan knew it. Kara knew it. Bren knew it. Everyone knew it. Matt Kovac's betrayal happened on the 105th day. Dan wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting it. He didn't know when. He didn't know how. But he knew Matt would break. People who hate always break quietly. The only question is the price they'll be offered. Matt left the village at night. No one noticed. In the morning, Ju found his tracks on the trail leading south, toward Lord Volt's castle. She ran to Dan. He was standing by the smokehouse, whittling arrows. Ju was gasping for breath from the run. She said 3 words. Matt. Gone. To Volt. Dan put down his knife. He looked up at the sky. Gray. Low. It smelled like snow. A blizzard would hit by nightfall. He did the math in his head. A day's ride to Lord Volta's castle. A day and a half on foot. Matt left at night. That meant he'd be at Lord Volta's by tomorrow evening. Then the Lord would need time to decide. A day, maybe 2. Then to gather his men. Another day. Then set out. A day's journey. 5 days total. Maybe 4. Maybe 6. But no more than a week. Dan gathered everyone. The town square. Morning. Cold. 28 people. The whole village. He stood before them and spoke calmly. He said that Matt had gone to see the Lord. That the Lord would come. That he would come with soldiers. That the village had to decide now, to leave or to stay. Silence. Long. Heavy. The village elder spoke first. He said there was nowhere to go. Winter. The forest. Wild animals. Without the village, they'd be dead by morning. Bren spoke second. He said he wouldn't go anywhere. This was his home. His father was born here, and his father's father. He would stand his ground. Ira spoke third. She didn't say anything. She simply picked up her bow and stood next to Dan. Liana took Tim by the hand and stood next to Era. Kara snorted and said that finally there would be a chance to see if the accounting department could handle the pressure. Nora took out her notebook and said she needed a defense plan to write down. Ju hopped on the spot and said she knew 4 secret exits from the village through the forest. May silently walked over and took her place in the line. It was decided. Dan worked for 5 days like he'd never worked before. 18 hours a day. Traps, arrows, positions. He checked every pit, every crossbow, every ambush spot. He positioned his men. Bren at the eastern approach, the most dangerous one, a wide trail. The horsemen will come this way. 3 pits on the trail. A cover behind the pits. Bren behind the cover with her bow. Aira on the roof of the smithy, the highest point in the village. A view in all directions. She sees everything. She shoots far. She shoots accurately. Her target, the officers. Not the soldiers, the officers. Take out the commander and the soldiers will be thrown into confusion. Liana and Nora are on the roof of the village headman's house. It's the second highest point. They're providing crossfire with the blacksmith shop. Kara is by the secret passage. It's a tunnel that started in the cellar beneath the blacksmith shop and led out to the ravine beyond the village. Kara found it 3 weeks ago while they were digging a storage pit. A hole in the ground. An old passage. Maybe ancient. Maybe dug by someone long ago. Kara cleared it out. She reinforced the walls. She checked the exit. If things go wrong, the children and the elderly will escape through the tunnel. Kara will lead the way. Ju is in the forest, not in the village, outside. She knows every tree. She'll move along the edge, keep watch, signal with a whistle. 2 short blasts mean they're coming. 1 long blast means there are many. 3 short blasts mean they're going around. Dan came up with the signaling system in a single evening. Ju learned it in half an hour. May is in the smithy. Bandages, herbs, roots for pain, ointment for burns. A decoction for washing wounds. Everything's ready. Everything's laid out. Everything is within reach. She won't be shooting. She'll be treating. And that's more important. Dan himself. He wasn't standing on the wall. He wasn't standing on the roof. He was standing in the center, on the roof of the blacksmith shop next to Ira, with a whistle between his teeth, with a plan in his head. His job isn't to shoot. His job is to see, to listen, to think, and to whistle. Signals for everyone. Everyone knows their signal. Everyone knows what to do when they hear their signal. They'd been training for 3 days, on the whistles, on the signals. Bren ran from position to position. Aira shot at targets from the roof against the clock. Liana reloaded. Nora counted the arrows. Kara checked the tunnel. Ju ran through the woods and whistled. By the 5th day, they were ready. As ready as a village of 30 people could be for an attack by 150 soldiers. On the 6th day, Ju arrived. 2 short whistles from the woods. They're coming. Then 1 long whistle. Lots of them. Dan stood on the roof of the smithy and looked south. People were emerging from behind the trees. Lots of people. On horseback and on foot. Spears, swords, shields. A banner with a black boar on a red field. Lord Garen Volt had brought his retinue. Dan counted. 50. 80. 100. 120. 150. Bren stood by the eastern palisade, cursing under his breath. Aira, standing next to Dan on the roof, knocked an arrow. Her hands were steady. Her face was stony. Only the muscles on her cheekbones twitched. Dan placed his hand on her shoulder. She looked at him. He shook his head. Not now. We'll wait. The soldiers stopped at the edge of the village. A horseman rode forward, alone, in fine armor, on a fine horse. Lord Garen Volt. Dan was seeing him for the first time. A large man, 45, gray at the temples, a heavy-set face, intelligent eyes, not angry, tired. The eyes of a man who makes decisions on which lives depend, and who is tired of it but cannot stop. Volt reined in his horse in the middle of the square. He looked around. He saw the traps. He saw the ambushes. He saw the archers on the rooftops. He saw the women with bows. His expression didn't change. He wasn't surprised. Matt had told him everything. He shouted. His voice was strong, commanding, accustomed to being heard and obeyed. He summoned the one in charge here. Dan came down from the roof via the staircase. Slowly. He stepped out onto the square, without a bow, without a sword, wearing a simple shirt with a shadow wolf pelt draped over it. His hands were empty. He stopped 10 paces from the horseman and looked up. Volt looked down. For a long time. In silence. Then he said that he'd imagined him to be older. Volt didn't attack right away. He was too smart for that. He dismounted. He handed the horse to his aide. He stood before Dan. They were almost the same height. Volt was slightly broader in the shoulders, heavier, older, with the weight of authority on his back. He said he hadn't come to fight. He had come to take what was rightfully his. The village of Caro stood on his land. The villagers were his people. The game from his forest is his game. The master who lives in his village is his master. Dan listened. Volt continued speaking. He said he was offering a simple exchange. Dan would go with him to the castle. He would live with honor. He would make bows for his retinue. He'll get a workshop, assistants, money, everything a master needs. In return, the village will be left in peace. No one will lay a hand on it. No one will harm it. It's fair. Dan said no. Volt raised an eyebrow. He asked why. Dan said because it wasn't an exchange. It was a purchase. And he wasn't for sale. Volt said that everything is for sale. It's just a matter of price. Dan said there are things that have no price. Volt was silent for a moment. Then he glanced back at his soldiers, 150 men. Then he looked up at the rooftops, 7 women with bows. Bren at the watchtower. The old village chief in the doorway of his house. The children were already being led toward the tunnel. He said that if Dan refused, he'd take it by force. That he was sorry. He didn't want bloodshed, but order must be maintained. If one village rises up, the others will too, and then everything would collapse. Dan said he understood. Then he said something that made Volt fall silent. He said the Lord could take the village. He could. He had enough men. But the price would be high. Traps on the trails, pits, crossbows, ambushes. 7 archers whose arrows pierce armor from 50 paces away. A blacksmith who made armor-piercing arrowheads. A scout who knows every trail. A herbalist who poisoned the stakes. Out of 150, he'll lose 30, maybe 40, before he even enters the village. And he'll lose the master, because Dan would rather burn down the workshop, break all the bows, and destroy all the blueprints than let himself be taken by force. Volt will get a pile of ashes and corpses. Not a single bow. Not a single arrowhead. Not a single secret. Volt listened. His face was impassive. His eyes were heavy. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that Dan was bluffing. Dan said he didn't know how to bluff. He's an engineer. He does the math. 30 casualties. Maybe 40. Among them, at least 3 officers, because the redhead on the smithy roof takes out the officers first. Ira stood on the roof and looked at Volt through the sight of her drawn bow. Volt looked at her, then at Dan. He asked who she was. Dan said, "The daughter of the man you hanged." Volt didn't flinch, but something in his eyes changed. He said, "A poacher's daughter is shooting at lords." Dan said, "A hunter's daughter is defending her home." Volt turned and walked back to his men. He didn't give an order. He didn't attack. He mounted his horse and silently gazed at the village. His officers stood nearby, waiting. The soldiers stood, waiting. Everyone waited. Dan stood in the middle of the square, empty-handed, waiting as well. An hour passed. The sun sank behind the trees. The shadows grew long. The air grew colder. Volt remained seated on his horse, silent. Then he gave an order. Quiet. Brief. Dan didn't hear it. But he saw the soldiers begin to move. Not forward, to the right, to flank. They moved in a chain through the forest. They were encircling the village from both sides. A classic encirclement. Volt didn't attack head-on. He struck from the flanks. Dan whistled. 2 short ones, 1 long one, 3 short ones. They're flanking. Zhu responded from the woods. She'd seen it. Bren moved from the eastern ambush point to the northern one. Nora and Liana turned around on the roof. Ira stayed put. She could see everything from above. The first soldiers stumbled into the pits on the northern trail. Screams. Curses. One fell. A second one sank in up to his waist. A stake pierced his thigh. He screamed, and his cry echoed through the woods. The soldiers stopped. They stopped moving in single file. They began to proceed cautiously. That cost them time that Dan was buying. Every minute of delay was a minute in which none of his men died. The second squad advanced from the west, through a dense spruce forest. A crossbow was set up there. The first soldier caught the string with his foot. Click! The arrow struck him in the chest from 3 paces away. His leather armor offered no protection. The bodkin pierced right through him. The soldier fell. The rest took cover. The commander shouted, "Withdraw! Take a wider detour! Time! Time! Time!" It was getting dark. Volt couldn't attack in the dark. His men didn't know this forest. They didn't know the traps. They didn't know the trails. In the dark, every step could be their last. He led his men away. He set up camp 100 paces from the village. Campfires, lookouts, waiting. It would be a long night. Dan stood on the roof and watched the campfires. There were many of them, red dots in the darkness. Each dot represented 10 soldiers, 15 campfires. 150 men, against 30. Ira stood beside him. She hadn't left the roof. She said she could take out 3 men at the nearest campfire right now. Dan said no, not now. We don't shoot at night. At night, we wait. Ira asked what we were waiting for. Dan said morning. Because in the morning, Volt will see something that will make him change his mind. Ira looked at him and asked what he had in mind. Dan said he hadn't come up with anything new. He'd just done the math. An hour after sunset, Kara emerged from the tunnel. She led out 7 children and 4 elderly people, quietly, across the ravine, into the forest, to the abandoned hunting lodge an hour's walk away that Jew had shown them a week ago. Safe, far away. Kara returned alone. Before dawn, Dan climbed down from the roof. He went around to check on everyone. Brenna was by the fence. Liana was at the forge in the smithy, where she'd been forging arrowheads until the very last moment. She'd sent Tim off with the children. For the first time in 3 months, the boy wasn't with her. Her hands were shaking, but her face was calm. Nora was on the roof of the village headman's house. She was writing something in a notebook by the light of a candle stub. Dan asked what she was writing. She said, "Everything, just in case." Dan took the notebook from her. He closed it. He gave it back. He said there wouldn't be a just in case. May was in the smithy among her herbs and roots. She looked up at Dan, and there was something strange in her eyes. Not fear, anticipation, as if she knew this night was important. Not for the village, for her. He didn't ask. Dawn was gray and cold. That fog stretched from the stream and lay low on the ground between the houses. Dan stood on the roof of the smithy and waited. He waited for a specific moment, the moment when the fog would begin to lift and visibility would increase to 100 paces. Because 100 paces was enough. Volt had roused the men before dawn. They formed a line. Shields in front, spears behind the shields. Swordsmen on the flanks. Well organized. Professional. 140 men. They'd lost 10 yesterday. 2 in the graves, 1 from a crossbow bolt. 7 wounded by spears with poisoned tips. May knew what she was doing. The poison didn't kill, but overnight, the wounds had become so inflamed that the 7 could not hold their weapons. Volt sat on his horse behind the formation. He would not lead the attack personally. He was the commander. He observed. He made the decisions. The formation moved forward, slowly, cautiously. Shields in front. 1 step, another step. They were expecting traps. They were walking across an open field in front of the village. There were pits in the forest along the trails. There were no pits here, but there were arrows. Dan whistled. 1 long whistle. Ira fired first. The arrow flew over the shields and struck the shoulder of an officer walking behind the formation. He fell. Nora fired the second arrow. It missed. The third arrow, a hit. A soldier in the front row dropped his shield and clutched his side. The bodkin pierced the leather armor as easily as paper. Liana fired. She hit the shield. The arrow went right through and lodged in the hand holding the shield. The soldier screamed and dropped his shield. The column marched on. Step G, step by step. Arrows rained down from above. From 2 rooftops. Crossfire. An arrow every 5 seconds. Every other one hit its mark. The formation reached the barrier. Felled trees. Sharp branches. Impossible to climb over. Impossible to go around. The formation stopped. Dan whistled twice. Bren struck from the flank. From behind the house. 3 arrows in a row, heavy, powerful, 60 pounds of draw weight. The arrows pierced the shields along with the arms behind them. The formation wavered. The right flank began to retreat. An officer shouted, "Halt!" Era took out the officer with her next arrow, a clean shot, to the neck, above the armor. He fell face first into the snow and didn't move. The right flank fled. The left flank was still holding. Soldiers scrambled over the earthwork. 2 of them made it over. Bren was waiting for them on the other side. He met the first one with an arrow at point-blank range. The second lunged at him with a sword. Bren parried with the bow's shaft and struck with his knife from below. A short strike, precise. The soldier slumped. The third changed his mind. The formation was falling apart. Arrows rained down from the rooftops without ceasing. Era fired like a machine. An arrow. Reload. An arrow. 3 seconds between shots. Every arrow found its mark. She didn't shoot at the shields. She shot at what was above the shields. Heads, necks, shoulders. She was shooting at the officers. In 20 minutes of battle, she'd taken out 4 of them. Without their officers, the soldiers were a herd. A large, dangerous, but leaderless herd. Volt saw it. He sat on his horse behind his men and watched his formation fall apart. He saw the arrows piercing through his best shields. He saw the woman on the roof who was killing his officers one by one with a precision that made him want to howl. He saw a blonde on the second roof who was counting the arrows and passing new ones to the archer next to her. He saw a dark-skinned woman with a scar who would dart out of a side alley and shoot those who had climbed over the barricade in the back, then vanish immediately. He saw a girl running between positions like a weasel, whistling, and the shooters on the rooftops turned in the direction she whistled. He saw a burly, red-bearded man behind the barricade, firing point-blank and never missing. He saw a village of 30 people grinding down his squad. He raised his hand. "Retreat!" The bugle sounded. The soldiers retreated. Quickly, with relief. They left 12 bodies on the field, another 20 wounded. 32 men in half an hour. Not a single casualty on the village's side. Volt sat on his horse and looked at the rooftops. Dan stood on the roof of the blacksmith shop. No bow, no weapons. A whistle around his neck. His hands were covered in blood from bandaging Brenna's cut forearm. Ira stood beside him. She had 3 arrows left. 3 arrows out of 20. 17 arrows. 17 shots. 14 hits. 4 officers killed. 10 soldiers wounded. She was breathing heavily. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from tension. She'd been shooting non-stop for 20 minutes, and every shot had been a close call. Volt dismounted. He took off his helmet. Gray temples. His face was wet with sweat. He walked forward, alone, unarmed, toward the village. His officer shouted, "Lord!" Volt didn't turn around. He walked across the field past the bodies of his soldiers, past broken shields, past arrows sticking out of the ground. He reached the stockade and stopped. Dan climbed down from the roof. He stepped out onto the square. They stood on opposite sides of the stockade and looked at each other. Volt spoke first. His voice was hoarse, heavy. He said that in 30 years of service, he had never lost so many men in a single morning. He said he now understood why Matt Kovac had called Dan a sorcerer, because what had happened could not be explained any other way. A village of 30 souls had stopped 150. Women were shooting from the roofs like guardsmen. Arrows pierced armor. Traps disrupted the formation. One man with a whistle was directing the battle like a general leading an army. Volt asked quietly, "Who are you?" Dan stood there, his hands covered in blood. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the frost. His face was ashen with exhaustion. He said simply, "Master, just a master." Volt looked at him. Then he looked behind Dan, out of the fog, out of the smoke from the forge, out of the gray morning light. Women emerged slowly. Ira with a bow, Liana with a hammer at her hip, Kara with a ledger under her arm and a knife on her belt, Nora with a notebook, Ju with a coil of rope slung over her shoulder, May with a basket of herbs. And last, Liana took a step back and took Tim by the hand, the boy Kara had led back through the tunnel when the battle ended. The boy was holding an arrow in his hand. That very one. The small one. The child's arrow. The one Dan had repaired for him a month ago. 7 women and a child. They stood in a semicircle behind Dan, silently, each in her place. And Volt stood there, looking at them. And something in his face was changing, slowly, irreversibly, like a crack in a stone that runs from the edge to the center. He hadn't lost the battle. He had lost something greater. He saw before him a world in which a poacher's daughter shoots better than his guards, in which a former slave keeps the books more accurately than his treasurer, in which a mute girl heals wounds better than his physician. A world where a blacksmith's widow forges steel stronger than his armorer, where a village girl knows the forest better than his scouts, where the village headman's daughter writes faster than his scribes. He saw a world that shouldn't exist by his rules. But it did, right in front of him, with bows and notebooks and baskets of herbs. He lowered his sword, slowly, the tip into the snow. He said one sentence. "Do you understand what you've broken?" Dan replied. "Yes, and I'll build it again. Only right this time." Volt led his men away. Not right away. He stood by the palisade for another half hour, in silence. Then he turned and left. He didn't say another word. He mounted his horse. He raised his hand. The column moved south, slowly. With the wounded on stretchers, with the dead lying across the saddles, the village watched them go. No one shouted. No one celebrated. Bren sat down on the ground by the stockade and sat there for a long time with his elbows propped on his knees. Era climbed down from the roof and went behind the barn. Not a sound came from there, but Dan knew she was crying. She always cried there. Liana entered the smithy and closed the door. A minute later, Dan heard the sound of a hammer. Steady. Rhythmic. She was forging. Because hands must do what they know how to do, especially when everything else is shaking. Kara was counting. Arrows used. Arrows remaining. Arrowheads intact. Arrowheads broken. She counted because it was the only thing she knew how to do when the world around her was falling apart. Nora wrote. Everything. Every minute of the battle. Every shot. Every whistle. She was writing a chronicle. For herself. For the village. For those who would come later and ask how 30 people stopped 150. Ju climbed a tree on the edge of the village and sat there until noon. She kept watch to make sure the soldiers didn't return. They didn't return. Hey, she treated a cut on Brenna's forearm. One of the hunters had a bruise from a splinter that had flown off a broken ambush post. Little Tim burned his finger on the bellows in the blacksmith shop while his mother was forging. May applied ointment made from roots to the burn, and the boy didn't cry because May was holding his hand and looking at him with her huge dark eyes, and in those eyes there was a warmth that kept the tears from falling. Dan sat alone on the roof of the blacksmith shop. He looked out at the forest, at the gray sky, at the smoke rising from the chimneys. His hands ached, his back ached, his head was buzzing. He hadn't slept for 2 days. He sat there thinking about what had just happened. 32 people, 12 dead, 20 wounded. They were people, not beasts. People, with families, with children, with wives waiting for them at home. He had done this. His plan, his arrows, his whistle. He didn't shoot them himself. He didn't kill a single one personally, but every death was his, because he had designed a machine that kills, and that machine worked flawlessly. He closed his eyes. Back in Portland, he had designed bows for athletes and hunters, for people who shot at targets and deer. Not at people. Never at people. And now he was sitting on a rooftop in a world that shouldn't exist, counting the dead. He opened his eyes. Down below, Tim was walking across the square. Little Tim, with a bandaged finger, holding a child's arrow in his hand. He was walking toward the blacksmith shop, toward his mom. He was walking, alive, healthy, well-fed. Dan built this. Not a machine of death. A place where children live. A place where women don't have to cry by the well. A place where a widow forges steel, and it's normal. Where a former slave keeps the books and is proud of it. Where the daughter of a man who was executed shoots better than anyone, and no one dares call her tainted. He built this. And for this, It's worth counting the dead. For 3 days after the battle, the village was silent. People walked and worked and ate and slept, but they spoke little, stunned. Then, on the fourth day, Bren came to Dan and said he wanted to go into the woods, to hunt. Not because they needed meat, because you have to do what you know how to do. The two of them set off together. Just like the first time, Bren in front, Dan behind him, right on his heels. They walked in silence. For a long time, deeper than they'd ever gone before, deeper than they'd ever gone whenever. Bren stopped at the edge of the familiar forest. Beyond that lay the thicket. The trees were older, taller, darker. The snow between them looked blue instead of white. The air was different, heavier, thicker, as if something were dissolved in it that wasn't present closer to the village. Bren pointed. That way. The tracks of the herd's king led into the thicket. Dan looked at the tracks, then at Bren. They didn't go any further. Not this time. But Dan memorized the direction. A week after the battle, a messenger arrived at the village, on horseback, unarmed, with a letter. The letter was from Lord Volt. Nora read it aloud. Volt's message was brief. The village of Cairo is hereby declared a free hunting settlement under the direct protection of the crown. Lord Volt renounces his rights to the land and its people. In return, he asks for one thing, a supply of bows for his men, at market price, through an official contract. Kara read it a second time, then a third. Then she looked at Dan and said that Volt wasn't a fool. He'd lost the battle, but he hadn't lost his head. He realized it was cheaper to buy bows than to lose soldiers. He realized it was cheaper to let the village go than to hold on to it. He realized the world had changed, and it was better to be on the side of change than against it. Dan said he'd accept the contract. Kara said the terms needed to be discussed. Dan said, "Of course, that's what you're here for." Kara looked at him. Then she turned away, quickly. But Dan had already noticed. She was smiling. The next day, a woman arrived at the village, alone, on foot, through the forest, barely alive, tall, black-haired, wearing a tattered guard's uniform, unarmed, with frostbitten hands and a face gray with exhaustion. She collapsed in the town square and couldn't get up. May was the first to rush over. Liana followed. They dragged the woman into the blacksmith shop, to the forge, into the warmth. May gave her a decoction to drink and rubbed her frostbitten fingers. The woman regained consciousness by evening. She gave her name, Celia Van Tail, a former junior officer in Lord Volt's personal guard. She had deserted a month ago after refusing to carry out an order to execute a peasant family in a neighboring province. She had fled. They were searching for her. She had been walking through the forest, alone, without food, without a fire, for 2 weeks. She survived because she was strong, and because she had nowhere to die. Dan came to her that evening. She was lying by the hearth, staring at the ceiling. He sat down beside her. He asked what she was skilled at. She said the sword. Drill, tactics, commanding a unit of up to 30 men. She said it like a list, without emotion, like someone listing what's left of themselves after losing everything else. Dan said he needed someone who could do all that. She looked at him. Her eyes were sunken, dark, empty. She asked why she should trust him. She had betrayed her oath. She's a deserter. She's a nobody. Dan stood up. He walked out of the forge. He returned a minute later. In his hands he carried a sword. Liana had been forging it for 2 months. Heavy, straight, made of cemented steel. The finest weapon ever to come out of this forge. Dan placed the sword before Celia. He said, "Don't swear an oath to me. Swear an oath to the village." Celia lay there, staring at the sword. Then she slowly sat up. Then she knelt. She took the sword in both hands. She raised it. She pressed the flat of the blade against her forehead. She was silent for a very long time. Then she said one word. "I swear." A month passed. Spring came, slowly, reluctantly. The snow began to melt. The streams swelled. The forest rustled differently. The birds returned. Dan stood on the roof of the blacksmith shop and looked out over the village. Cairo had changed. Not on the outside, on the inside. People walked differently, more upright, more confidently. Children played in the square and laughed, and that laughter was different. Not the cautious laughter of hungry children who fear that the food will run out. Open, free. Liana was forging in the smithy. Beside her was an apprentice, a boy from a neighboring village who had come to learn. The first one. Kara sat at the table with Nora, and they were compiling the trade register. 3 contracts. Torin Hell, Lord Volt, and a new merchant from the capital whom Torin had brought on his last visit. Era was in the forest. She left every morning and returned in the evening with cattle. Bren went with her. They became a hunting pair. He was strength. She was speed. Together, they were the best hunting team within a 5-day journey's radius. Ju ran between the villages, Caro and Hawkmire, and 2 more villages further east. She carried letters, messages, orders. She became a courier, a living mail carrier. She loved to run. Celia trained the militia, 10 men and 4 women. Every morning, formation, marching, the basics of sword fighting, the basics of shield use. She was strict, demanding, fair. The village respected her, feared her a little, but respected her. May. May had changed the most. The trances became more frequent, once every 3 days, sometimes once every 2. She would freeze for half a minute. Her eyes would go blank. Sounds came from her throat, hoarse, low, sometimes resembling words, in a foreign language, a language no one in the village knew. One night, Dan woke up to a sound. May was sleeping in the smithy in her usual spot by the wall. She was talking in her sleep, clearly, loudly, in a language that didn't exist. The words were long, strange, with guttural and sibilant sounds found in none of the languages Dan had heard here. Liana sat by the forge and listened. Her face was pale. She looked at Dan and silently said one word: the temple. That morning, Dan made a decision. He gathered his team: Bren, Ira, Ju, Celia, May. 5 of them, 6 including him. He said they would go into the forest, deeper than they'd ever gone before, to where the tracks of the herd's king lead, to where the stones are warm in winter, to the place where May hears a voice in her dreams. Bren nodded. He'd been expecting this. Ira grabbed her bow. Ju said she knew the way. Celia strapped on her sword. May stood there, gazing toward the forest. Her eyes were clear, clearer than ever, as if the fog that had shrouded them her whole life was beginning to lift. They set out at dawn. Liana stood by the blacksmith's shop, holding Tim in her arms, and watched them go. Kara stood beside her. Nora with her notebook. The 3 women who remained. The 3 women who would hold the village while the rest ventured into the darkness. Liana said nothing. She simply raised her hand. Dan raised his in response. The forest took them in. Quiet, dense. The trees closed in behind them. They walked all day. Ju led the way. She knew the trails up to a certain point. Then the trails ended. Beyond that lay a forest they had never ventured into. Old, dark, with trees whose trunks were thicker than the walls of houses. The animal tracks here were different, larger, deeper. The deer here were bigger than the ones that roamed near the village, much bigger. By evening they found a stone, warm, with markings, then a second one, then a third. The stones stood at regular intervals, like signposts, like road signs. They were leading somewhere. May walked along, touching each stone with her hand. With every touch, her lips moved. She wasn't speaking, but her lips were moving, as if her body were recalling words her mind didn't know. On the second day, they found a temple. It stood in a clearing deep within the forest, old, made of stone, covered in moss and lichen. The walls were thick, smooth, made of a stone Dan had never seen in this world. Gray-blue, almost glowing in the twilight. The entrance was open. The stone doors had been pushed aside. Light streamed out from within. Blue, faint, pulsating like a heartbeat. May stopped in front of the entrance. She stood there looking inside. Then she turned to Dan. She opened her mouth and spoke. For the first time in her life. Her voice was quiet, hoarse, broken. like the voice of someone who had been silent for 19 years and had finally broken through a wall. She said 3 words. "I remember this." Bren dropped his bow. Era clutched the bowstring. Ju pressed her hand to her mouth. Celia placed her palm on her sword. Dan stood there, looking at May. She was crying. Tears streamed down her cheeks. But her voice didn't waver. She repeated it. "I remember that." Then she entered the temple. They followed her inside. It was warm inside. The walls glowed with the same blue light. On the floor were symbols like those on the stones in the forest, only brighter, sharper, deeper. The corridor led downward. They descended. The light grew brighter. The air thickened. It became heavy and sweet. It smelled of something ancient, not rot, not dust, but something alive. Something was breathing deep within this place, something enormous, ancient, and patient. They emerged into a hall. Round, high-ceilinged. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. The walls were covered with reliefs, figures of people, or not quite people, creatures in long robes, with elongated faces and eyes without pupils. Priestesses. May looked at them, her lips moving as she whispered words in a language she didn't know and yet had always known. In the center of the hall stood a stone, large, flat, like an altar. A crystal hung in the air above it, a core, but not like the ones in the beasts. Enormous, the size of a head, blue, pulsating. Waves emanated from it. Heat, light, and something else. Something Dan felt not with his skin but with his bones. A deep, steady hum. The very one Brenna's grandfather had spoken of. A hum you don't hear with your ears but feel with your spine. May walked up to the crystal. She reached out her hand. She touched it. The crystal flashed. Light flooded the hall. Blue. Blinding. Dan closed his eyes. When he opened them, the walls were glowing even brighter. The reliefs had come to life. No, not come to life. They had become visible. All of them. Every single one. And Dan saw. On the wall opposite the entrance were figures. 3. The first, a woman. She was holding something in her hands. A tool. A hammer and tongs. Beneath her was an inscription in symbols that Dan couldn't read, but May could. She read it aloud in a voice that trembled and didn't tremble at the same time. She who brought fire to iron. The second figure, a man, an ear of grain in his hands. An inscription beneath him. May read it. He who brought grain to the earth. The third figure, a man, holding a bow, short, curved, composite. Dan stared at the third figure, and the world around him froze. The face on the relief was his own. His cheekbones, his nose, the line of his chin, carved in stone, 800 years before he was born. May read the final inscription. He who will bring the bow into his hands. Dan stood before the stone wall, gazing at his own face in the stone, and the world he knew shattered and reassembled itself. He hadn't ended up here by accident. He had been summoned. This temple, this crystal, this mechanism older than all the kingdoms. It had summoned masters when the world needed change. The woman who taught them to smelt iron, the man who brought agriculture, and him, the engineer from Portland, who makes bows. May stood beside him. She held his hand. Her fingers were warm. For the first time ever, her fingers were warm. She was speaking, quietly, in the language of the temple. Words flowed from her like water from a spring. The block has been removed. The wall has been destroyed. She was the last priestess, the daughter of a lineage that had served the temple for 1,000 years, given to the healer as a child, sealed away, protected, until the moment the one they had been waiting for arrived. She turned to face him. Her eyes were enormous, dark, wet, clear. She spoke in the common tongue, slowly, choosing her words carefully, like a child learning anew. I've been waiting for you. I didn't know, but I waited. Bren stood by the wall and said nothing. Tears streamed down his beard, and he didn't wipe them away. Aira held her bow with pale fingers and stared at the relief-bearing Dan's face. Ju sat on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. Celia stood at the entrance with her sword drawn, keeping watch over the hallway because even at that moment, someone had to stand guard. Dan stood in front of the wall, holding the hand of the girl who, for the first time in her life, had spoken to tell him that he had come to the place he was meant to be. He thought of the village, of Liana by the horn, of Tim with his child's arrow, of Kara with the ledger, of Nora with her notebook, of the 7 women who stood on the rooftops with bows, defending their home. He didn't want to be the prophecy on the wall. He wanted to be a master in the blacksmith shop, a man who makes bows not just in general, but for a specific person, for a specific hand, for a specific shoulder. But prophecy or not, he was here. And the village was waiting for him up above. And the forest was changing all around them. And the beasts were growing. And the world needed what he knew how to do. He let go of May's hand. He looked at his team. Bren, Aira, Ju, Celia, May. 5 people. His people. He said, "Let's go home." They left the temple at dawn on the 3rd day. The forest greeted them with silence and light. The morning sun filtered through the branches, and the snow on the trees sparkled with gold. They were walking home, through the old forest, through a young one. Through the undergrowth and clearings and familiar trails, Ju ran ahead. Aira walked beside Dan. Bren brought up the rear. Celia kept her sword at the ready because the forest is the forest, and you can't let your guard down. May walked and talked, quietly, to herself. She tried on words like new clothes. She experimented with sounds. She smiled when it worked. She frowned when her tongue wouldn't obey. She was making up for 19 years of silence, and there was anywhere. They reached the village around noon. Liana was standing by the blacksmith shop. She saw them and froze. Then she ran. Tim ran after her. Kara came out of the village headman's house with a quill behind her ear. Nora emerged from behind the table with an ink stain on her cheek. They stood in the square. All together. 12 people. 7 women, 5 men, and 1 boy with a child's bow. The Caro clan. Dan looked at them and thought he didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know what had awakened in the temple or what it wanted. He didn't know what the guild would do when it found out about the bows. He didn't know what the king would do when he heard about the village that defeated the Lord. He didn't know anything about what was to come. But he knew what was there. A forge with a fire burning inside. A table with blueprints laid out on it. A smokehouse where meat hangs. A woman who forges steel better than any man in the province. Another who calculates more accurately than any treasurer. A third who shoots more accurately than any guard. A fourth who writes faster than any scribe. A fifth who knows the forest better than any tracker. A sixth who spoke for the first time, and the world heard her. A seventh who came out of the darkness and found light at a stranger's doorstep. And him, the master. Simply the master, who makes bows, not just any bows, but specifically for Liana. And those are 2 different things. Kara walked up to him. She looked him in the eyes. She spoke quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Idiot. Now we're all yours." Dan stood in the middle of his village and, for the first time in 120 days, wasn't counting. He wasn't planning. He wasn't solving equations. He was just standing there. And he was home, where somewhere deep in the forest, in an ancient temple, a blue crystal pulsed. The stone doors remained open. The ancient mechanism was working. The world was changing. Slowly, irreversibly, just as it always changed when the master arrived.